She walked into that throne room as a queen and walked out as a lesson nobody saw coming. The night Vaelor Draven tore the Luna crown from Seraphine Ashmore's head in front of every noble house in the Empire, he thought he was making an example of her. He was. Just not the one he intended, because 3 days later, the neighboring empire had a new queen, and she was wearing a different crown, one she didn't beg for, one nobody could take. Stay with me till the very end, because this story will rearrange something inside your chest. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to know where my people are watching from tonight. The crimson moon came once every 7 years. It rose fat and red above the Draven capital like a wound in the sky, and every soul in the Lycan Empire understood what it meant. Not just the anniversary of the throne, the reckoning of loyalty, the public accounting of alliances, the night when every wolf in the Empire watched to see which bonds held and which ones had already rotted through. The palace burned with 1,000 lanterns strung across the courtyard archways, crystal chandeliers dragging prismatic light through the grand hall, until the marble floors looked like something holy had bled across them. Seraphine Ashmore stood at the top of the staircase and watched the Empire fill the room below her. She had dressed deliberately tonight. Not for beauty. She had long since learned that beauty in a court like this one was just another weapon someone else would eventually try to take from you. She wore deep charcoal silk with silver thread worked into the collar and cuffs, the kind of garment that said authority without announcing it. The Luna crown sat against her dark hair the way it always had, steady, undemonstrative, like a thing that belonged there because it simply did, because it had earned its place. Her back was straight, her jaw was set. She had been a queen for 4 years. Not a figurehead, not a decorative extension of Vaelor's power. A working queen who had rebuilt the Empire's eastern trade routes after the flood collapse of the Sorthane passes, who had personally renegotiated the grain agreements with the lowland territories after a dry season nearly cracked the outer provinces into open rebellion. She knew the names of every major house steward, every regional commander, every border warden from the northern ice shelf to the Ashen coast. She knew where the bodies were buried, not as metaphor, as fact. She took the stairs. The court watched her descend the way courts always watched, with smiles that never quite reached the upper face, with attention divided between admiration and the particular kind of hunger that lives in people who profit from other people's falls. Councillor Renwick was laughing too loudly near the east column. He always laughed too loudly when he was working an angle. Seraphine had documented 3 separate kickback arrangements he'd engineered through the Northern Fur contracts, enough to end his career, enough to end his freedom if she'd ever chosen to use it. She hadn't. She'd held it instead, because a weapon you haven't fired yet has more value than one you've already spent. She noted his position. She moved on. The hall smelled of wood smoke and mulled wine and too many perfumes trying to cover too many anxieties. The orchestra played something brisk and ceremonial near the far end, and couples moved through the designated space with the mechanical grace of people who had been doing this long enough that their bodies no longer needed to consult their minds. Seraphine accepted 2 greetings from minor house representatives on her way across the room, kept both exchanges precise and warm in equal measure, and located Vaelor without appearing to look for him. He was near the dais. Of course he was near the dais. King Vaelor Draven stood 6'4" in his dress grays, broad as a doorframe, with the kind of physical presence that had never needed the crown to announce itself. His hair was dark and close-cropped above the temples, and his jaw carried the particular set it always carried in public, hard, deliberate, communicating nothing while projecting absolute certainty. He was 31 years old and had held this throne since he was 26, and in 5 years he had expanded the Empire's boundaries by 1/3 and its reputation for ruthlessness by considerably more. He was talking to Lord Commander Aldrich Morn, who stood at his left shoulder like a very large and loyal piece of furniture. She could read Vaelor's posture from 40 feet away, the slight forward lean, the reduced blink rate, the way his right hand stayed loose at his side rather than clasped behind his back. He was performing ease. He was not at ease. Something was wrong. Seraphine had been reading Vaelor Draven for 4 years. She had learned his tells the hard way, through rooms that went cold without warning, and silences that landed like fists, and conversations that began as strategy sessions and ended as something she could never quite name but always recognized. She knew the difference between his public tension and his private tension. She knew the difference between a bad day and a decision already made. This was a decision already made. Her stride didn't change. Her expression didn't change. She took a glass of wine from a passing server, held it without drinking, and finished crossing the floor. 3 house lords acknowledged her in sequence. She returned each acknowledgement, brief and genuine, filing the details of each exchange in the part of her mind that never fully rested. Lord Cavan looked uncertain about something. Lady Asara Ven was watching Vaelor with an expression that occupied the precise territory between sympathy and satisfaction. That told Seraphine more than anything else in the room. Asara Ven had been working to undermine her position for 14 months. Subtle work, the kind that left no fingerprints, just a slow accumulation of small suggestions planted in the right ears at the right moments. She had never done it openly enough to give Seraphine anything clean to address. She had understood, in the way that truly dangerous people always understand, that direct confrontation would only demonstrate Seraphine's competence. The goal was erosion, not collision, and now she was standing 20 feet from the dais with something that looked like relief. Seraphine set her wine glass on the nearest surface and kept walking. Vaelor turned when she was 10 feet away. His eyes found her with the immediate, precise focus that had nothing to do with affection and everything to do with the predator's instinct that had made him what he was. He looked at her for 1 full second, the kind of look that takes inventory, and then he looked away. He looked away. In 4 years of public appearances, Vaelor Draven had never looked away from her first. Seraphine stopped 2 feet from him. "Your Majesty," she said, because the court was watching and she was not going to give them anything sloppy. Seraphine. Not Luna, not Queen, just her name, pronounced like a door closing. Lord Commander Morn had gone rigid in a way that only people with military training do when they're trying very hard not to show they know something. Seraphine looked at him once, long enough to confirm it, and then she turned her full attention back to Vaelor. "The House delegations are assembled," she said. "The Sorthane representatives arrived late, weather on the mountain road. I've arranged their seating adjustment so the slight won't register." "That's handled," Vaelor said. "I handled it this afternoon." "I mean, it doesn't matter." She held his gaze. "Everything in this room matters. You know that." His jaw shifted. Something moved behind his eyes that she didn't immediately recognize because she had never seen it directed at her before. Not quite like this. It was the specific discomfort of a man who has already decided to do something he knows is a mistake and has committed to it anyway because going back would require admitting he got there wrong. "The ceremony begins in 20 minutes, he said. "Take your position." She took her position. The hall filled the rest of the way. The orchestra shifted into the formal processional arrangement. The house lords and ladies arranged themselves in the long traditional lines that flanked the approach to the throne dais, and the servants extinguished the outer lanterns so that the chandelier light concentrated at the center of the room, a single column of brilliance falling across the open floor in front of the throne. Seraphine stood at Vaelor's left side, with her spine locked and her hands still, and her face doing the particular thing it had learned to do in public, present, composed, and entirely unreadable. The crimson moon shone through the high windows. Vaelor spoke the opening words of the ceremony from memory, as he always did, the words his father had spoken and his grandfather before that. The compact between the king and his empire, the acknowledgement of the throne's obligations to the houses and the empire's obligations to the blood of those who had bled to build it. He had a powerful voice. Whatever else was true of Vaelor Draven, his voice had never failed him in a room. It filled the hall without effort, resonant and absolute, the kind of voice that made the body respond before the mind caught up. Seraphine listened. She noticed which lords were watching Vaelor and which were watching her. She noticed that Councillor Renwick had moved closer to the dais than protocol suggested he should be. She noticed that the door to the east corridor was being held slightly open by a guard who was not, as far as she could determine, assigned to that position tonight. She catalogued. She waited. "This anniversary marks a reckoning," Vaelor said, and something in his cadence changed so slightly that only someone who had been listening to him for 4 years would have caught it. Not only of the Empire's strength, but of the loyalties that sustain it. The hall was very quiet. A throne cannot stand on uncertain foundation. An empire cannot survive the rot that enters through its own walls. He paused. It is the duty of a king to remove that rot, no matter where it lives. Seraphine understood, not in pieces. The whole shape of it arrived at once, the way a view resolves when you finally reach the ridge. The 14 months of Izaraven's quiet work, the long conversations that Vaelor had been having with the High Council that he had stopped summarizing for her 3 months ago. The east corridor door held open. Morn's rigid posture, the look Vaelor had given her when she crossed the hall. Inventory, not recognition. She did not move. She did not breathe differently. Her face did not change. This was the thing they would never understand about her. Not Vaelor, not Renwick, not the entirety of this magnificent and venal court. She had grown up in a house where emotion displayed on the surface was a resource handed directly to your enemies. Her father had taught her that before he taught her anything else. You feel everything, Sarah. You just never let them see it for free. Vaelor turned to face her. The hall was absolutely silent now, the kind of silence that has weight. Seraphine Ashmore, he said. His voice was flat, formal, the voice he used for sentencing. You stand accused before the assembled houses of the Lycan Empire of conducting unauthorized negotiations with foreign kingdoms, of passing imperial intelligence to rival courts, of using the authority of the Luna's position to advance agendas contrary to the security of this throne. Someone in the crowd made a sound that wasn't quite a gasp and wasn't quite a murmur. It moved through the room like a wave. Seraphine said, "No." Vaelor's eyes narrowed by a fraction. "No?" "That is incorrect," she said, and her voice came out level and clean, no tremor in it, not a single vibration of the rage that was building somewhere beneath her sternum like a fire finding its oxygen. Every correspondence I have conducted in 4 years has been documented and available to the Council record. Every diplomatic contact has been disclosed. You have reviewed those records yourself, twice. The records you provided, Vaelor said, the complete records, which can be independently verified by which can be manipulated by the very hand that created them. The words landed in the room and sat there. Seraphine looked at him, really looked at him, the way she hadn't allowed herself to in months, because looking at him clearly required acknowledging things she had chosen not to examine. She saw the set of his shoulders. She saw the particular vacancy in his eyes that appeared when he had already determined that what he was doing was necessary, and had therefore stopped engaging with the possibility that it wasn't. She saw the subtle angle of his chin toward Councillor Renwick, barely perceptible, but there. She understood the whole architecture of it. The accusation hadn't come from Vaelor's own conviction. The accusation had been fed to him by people who understood that Seraphine Ashmore was the only person in this empire who could see what they were doing and had the standing to stop it. The only way to remove that obstruction without exposing themselves was to remove it through him. They had used the one thing they knew how to use, his pride. "You have evidence," she said, not a question. She was buying herself time to think, not because she needed to believe him, but because she needed to understand exactly which evidence they had manufactured. "We have testimony." "From whom?" He didn't answer, which meant the answer would embarrass him if he said it aloud. "Vaelor." She dropped the title because the room was going to remember this moment for the rest of its collective life, and she wanted them to remember that she had spoken to him like a person and not a rank. "You have known me for 4 years. You have worked alongside me for 4 years. Whatever you have been told, what I have been told," he said, and his voice shifted into something harder, something that was trying to shut down the exchange before it went further, is that the woman standing beside this throne has been conducting a private correspondence with Cassian Thorn for 11 months. The name fell into the silence like a stone, into still water. Cassian Thorn, king of the Valthari Empire, Vaelor's oldest territorial rival, the man whose kingdom had been pressing at the eastern borders of the Lycan Empire for 3 years with the patient, Systematic pressure of someone who understood that the right geography applied over enough time was more effective than any army. Seraphine had contacted Cassian Thorn once, 14 months ago. A single correspondence formally routed through the Council's own diplomatic channel concerning a proposed trade framework that would have simultaneously benefited both kingdoms and reduced the border tensions that were costing the Lycan Empire 300 soldiers a year in unnecessary skirmishes. She had disclosed it, immediately, in writing, with copies to the Council and to Vaelor's own private secretary. Vaelor knew this. He had signed the acknowledgement himself. She looked at him, and she thought, he knows, and he is doing it anyway, because they told him something else, and he chose to believe it, and now he is committed to the telling in front of every house in the Empire, and going back requires becoming someone who admits he was managed, and that is the one thing he will not become. Vaelor, she said, very quietly, just for him. Don't do this. It's done, he said. Then he reached up and he took the crown from her head. He did it with one hand. He wasn't rough about it. There was something almost careful in the gesture, which was somehow worse than roughness would have been. He lifted the Luna crown from her hair and held it, and he turned to face the assembled court with it in his hand, and he said, in the voice that filled rooms without effort, "The bond between this throne and Seraphine Ashmore is hereby severed. Her title, her standing, and her access to this court are revoked by the authority of the Alpha Throne, effective this night. She is to be escorted from Imperial territory within 72 hours. The court applauded. Not all of it, not even most of it, if she'd been able to count with any precision. But enough. The houses that had always resented her presence, the lords who had spent 4 years watching a woman understand their empire better than they did and had never forgiven her for it, the counselors who had something to protect and had been waiting for exactly this. The sound was enthusiastic and immediate, the applause of people who had been waiting for permission. Isara Ven was smiling. Seraphine stood in the middle of the chandelier light, with her hair slightly disturbed where the crown had been, and her hands at her sides and the full attention of the Lycan Empire's court on her face. And she made one decision. She would not beg, she would not cry, she would not argue, she would not give this room the satisfaction of watching her fracture. Not because she wasn't fracturing, she was somewhere deep and internal where it would take her years to fully assess the damage. But fracture was information, and she was not giving this room any more of her information for free. She straightened her collar. She held Vaelor's gaze for 3 seconds, long enough to make sure he understood that she was choosing to look at him, not failing to look away. And then she turned and she walked toward the staircase she had descended an hour ago with a crown on her head. No one stepped aside for her. She walked through the crowd the way water finds its path, without hesitation, without collision. And the people in her way moved because something in the quality of her movement made standing in it feel like a mistake. She kept her chin level. She kept her hands still. She went up the stairs with her back to 300 people, and she did not hurry. Behind her, someone laughed. She recognized the voice. Renwick. She kept walking. Her rooms were already being prepared for inventory. She understood this before she opened the door. The guards outside her suite had been replaced with ones she didn't recognize, wearing the insignia of the council security detail rather than the palace household rotation. The door was unlocked when it should have been sealed to anyone but her. Someone had been in there already. She pushed the door open and walked in. 2 women she had never seen before were standing near her writing desk with careful expressions and a large wooden chest between them. They both went still when she entered. "You're cataloging," Seraphine said. "My lady." "Former, no title." She moved past them toward the desk, and she did the thing she had trained herself to do in every high-pressure moment of the last 4 years. She slowed her breathing to a count, she identified the 3 most urgent facts in front of her, and she acted on the first one. "Everything on this desk is personal correspondence, not imperial property. I'll need documentation of anything you remove. We have instructions. I'm sure you do. I'm giving you additional instructions that cover your legal exposure if this catalog is later reviewed by a neutral court." She looked at the woman who had spoken. Young, uncertain, doing a job she clearly hadn't expected to be this complicated. "Document everything. Dates, categories, a written receipt. If you don't, and this is later contested, you are personally liable for any items found missing. That's the law. You can verify it. The woman looked at her colleague. Her colleague gave a small nod. Yes, we'll document it. Thank you. She moved to the window. The crimson moon sat above the garden, unchanged, enormous and indifferent. The lanterns in the courtyard below were still burning. She could hear the orchestra from here. Resumed now. The formal ceremony apparently concluded. The Empire had returned to its dancing. She stood at the window for a long time. She was not thinking about Vaelor. She had put Vaelor in a compartment that would remain sealed for the foreseeable future, because the contents of that compartment were not useful right now. What was useful? The letter she had written 6 weeks ago and placed in the personal correspondence of Daria Ashcroft, her most trusted attendant, who was currently visiting her family home in the neutral territories and would have no official connection to anything that happened here tonight. What was useful? The contact information committed to memory that Daria carried in the specific cipher they had established 18 months ago, during a period when Seraphine had first begun to understand that the High Council's particular combination of ambition and coordination represented a structural threat that her official position might not survive. What was useful? The fact that she had, over the course of 4 years, learned every major secret this empire housed, not by surveillance, not by subversion, but simply by being the most competent person in every room she walked into and paying attention. She had not used those secrets. She had not wanted to use them. She had wanted to use them in the service of the empire that had made them, the throne she had genuinely believed she was serving, the work that had been real even if everything else turned out to be otherwise. She was no longer bound by that restraint. She turned from the window. The catalogers were working carefully, precisely, exactly as she had instructed. She moved to her wardrobe and began selecting clothing with the same methodology she brought to everything else. What she needed, nothing more, nothing that would slow her down. Daria's letter was already on its way to the contact she had specified. The response, when it came, would reach a particular innkeeper in the capital's trade district who had served as an informal message relay for 3 different empires over 20 years, and who had an arrangement with Seraphine that predated her Luna title by a considerable distance. She gave herself 72 hours. That was what Vaelor had given her. She intended to use all of them, but not in the way he expected. The night was cold when it had been warm an hour ago. She folded a traveling coat and set it aside. She found the correspondence documents she wanted, her own copies, maintained separately from the council record, the ones that constituted an independent verification of every disclosure she had made and every directive she had received, and she secured them in the personal document case that was unambiguously hers. She worked without stopping until the catalogers had finished and she was alone. By morning, the story had reached the city. The capital's common quarter moved news faster than any official communication. 1,000 merchants and servants and tradespeople who moved between the palace and the city like blood through veins, carrying information in both directions with the casual efficiency of people who had been doing it for generations. By the time Seraphine walked out of the palace's lower servants' entrance at 6 in the morning, with a case in her hand and a coat around her shoulders, the broad shape of what had happened the night before was already common knowledge in every tavern within 3 miles. She walked without an escort. The guards at the lower gate let her pass. They had received no specific instruction to stop her, only to admit no one knew. And she noted that procedural gap in the part of her mind that was still running the full accounting of last night's decisions, cross-referencing each one against the most plausible explanations, building a picture that was becoming cleaner and more damning with every additional data point. The city was raw and gray at this hour. The market stalls were setting up, the vendors calling to each other in the flat shorthand of people who had shared a working space for years. She bought bread from a woman who recognized her and pretended not to. And she ate it walking because she was hungry, and because hunger was a physical fact that required addressing, and she was not in the business of ignoring physical facts. The innkeeper's name was Barold. He was 63 years old, enormously bearded, and had the particular impassivity of someone who had spent 4 decades in the professional business of not having opinions about the things he witnessed. He looked up when she walked in, looked back down at the account book he was working in, and said without inflection, "Room's ready. Has anything come?" "Came an hour ago." He reached under the counter without looking and produced a sealed letter. Plain paper, no crest, sealed with clear wax over a fold that she recognized by its geometry alone. She took it and went upstairs. The room was small and smelled of pine resin and cold stone. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and broke the seal. The letter was in cipher. She read it in under a minute because she had written the cipher herself. She sat with the letter in her hands for a long time after. Then she folded it carefully and held it over the small candle on the bedside table and watched it turn to ash. She had 3 options. She had mapped them out mentally in the hours between leaving the palace and arriving here, turning each one over the way you turn a stone to examine what lies underneath. The first option was the most obvious and the most useless. Legal appeal, formal protest through the court system, an attempt to demonstrate the falseness of the accusation through official channels. She discarded this immediately, not because the evidence wasn't on her side, but because the channels themselves were compromised. The counsel that had built the case against her controlled the review process for exactly this kind of dispute. Appealing to them was appealing to the architect of the trap. The second option was to disappear. She had resources enough. She had contacts in 4 neutral kingdoms and 2 that weren't particularly neutral, but had reason to value her knowledge. She could build a quiet, safe, entirely uninfluential life somewhere far from everything that had just been done to her. She would survive. She would be free. She discarded this one too. Not because of Vaelor. She needed to be very clear with herself about that. She was past the point where her choices were being made in reaction to him, but because what she had seen last night, the architecture of it, the long patience of it, the precision with which the High Council had managed the most powerful Alpha King alive and bent him to an outcome he hadn't chosen but had executed as though it were his own conviction. That was not a problem that disappeared when she disappeared. That was a problem that was going to consume the Lycan Empire from the inside, and probably 2 or 3 neighboring empires along with it, and she was the only person currently alive who had both the knowledge and the external standing to do anything about it. External standing. That was the third option. The letter had been an offer, a genuine one, which she had found surprising enough to read 3 times before concluding that it was precisely what it presented itself as. Not a political transaction dressed as rescue, but a strategic partnership offered by someone who understood exactly what she was and what she knew and was interested in both things on their actual merits. Cassian Thorne's handwriting was precise and economical. He did not waste words, even in cipher. The letter said, "I heard what happened last night. I imagine you saw it coming longer than anyone else did. My kingdom has an open seat at the strategic table and a tradition of filling that seat with the most capable person available, regardless of where they came from. If you're interested in what that looks like in practice, my Eastern Border representative can arrange a meeting in the neutral territories within 48 hours. No obligation. No performance of gratitude required. Come because it serves your purposes or don't come at all." She had read those last 4 words several times. Come because it serves your purposes or don't come at all. Not rescue, not charity, not the particular transaction that most men in Cassian Thorne's position would have framed it as. The fallen queen accepted into the conqueror's court, trading her knowledge for his protection, occupying the subordinate position that every formal structure of such an arrangement implied. A seat at the table, because she was the most capable person available. She looked at the ash in the candle tray. She thought about the applause last night, the specific sound of it, not its volume, but its enthusiasm, the relief in it, 300 people exhaling at the removal of a woman who made them feel inadequate in their own court. She thought about Vaelor's hand lifting the crown from her hair with that almost careful gesture, like he was returning a book to a shelf rather than dismantling 4 years of a person's life. She thought about Renwick's laugh. She thought about what she knew. Every supply contract for the northern campaigns, every diplomatic back channel from the last 6 years, the real financial architecture behind the Eastern trade agreements, not the documented version, the actual one, with the names of the intermediaries and the movement of funds that didn't appear in any council record because they were never meant to. The identity of the informant inside Cassian Thorne's own border council, who had been feeding intelligence to Vaelor's High Council for 2 years. The structural weakness in the Lycan Empire's grain reserve system that would, if the next harvest came in low, produce a supply crisis within 8 months that the current political configuration was completely unequipped to manage. She knew where every body was buried, and she had just been handed the freedom to decide what to do about it. She stood up. She straightened her coat. She checked the document case once and confirmed it was secure. She had 72 hours before her formal banishment took effect. She had no intention of using all of them. The longer she remained inside the Empire's borders, the more time the Council had to realize that what they had done last night wasn't just a political removal. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. She needed to be across the neutral territory border before that understanding reached anyone who could act on it. She went downstairs. Barold was still at his counter. "I'll need a horse," she said, "and directions to the eastern road." He looked up at her with the expression of a man who has seen 50 years of political upheaval and has developed a comprehensive immunity to its drama. "Traveling light?" "Light enough." He nodded once, closed his account book, and called for his stable hand without further comment. Seraphine Ashmore walked out of the Lycan Empire the same way she had walked out of the palace, with her back straight, her hands still, and her face telling nobody anything at all, untouched. On the morning of the third day after the Crimson Moon, a rider arrived at the Valthari Imperial Palace bearing a sealed document with the crest of the Neutral Territories Council, a standard diplomatic communication of the sort that crossed that border dozens of times a week. The palace's chief herald received it at the gate, noted its routing designation, and delivered it according to protocol to the Foreign Affairs Chamber, where it waited in a stack of similar correspondence until the morning session of the Diplomatic Council convened. It was opened by a junior secretary who read it once, blinked, and immediately carried it to his superior. His superior read it twice, pushed back from his desk, and went directly to the king's receiving chamber. 2 hours later, the Valthari Empire's eastern border representative sent a sealed response back across the neutral territory line. The response contained 11 words. 12 hours after that, every house lord in the Lycan Empire received a formal communique bearing the seal of the Valthari imperial throne. It was brief, formal, and impeccably structured in the diplomatic language of official proclamation. It announced the Valthari Empire's gratitude for the distinguished service of Seraphine Ashmore, whose expertise in strategic counsel had been of significant value to the Empire's ongoing security interests, and whose recent availability had allowed the formalization of an arrangement that benefited both parties. It announced the appointment of Seraphine Ashmore to the position of Queen Consort of the Valthari Empire, contingent upon the formal completion of a state marriage to His Majesty King Cassian Thorn, to be conducted at the Valthari capital within the fortnight. It was signed by Cassian Thorn. It was countersigned in clean dark ink at the bottom of the page, in a handwriting that every lord in the Lycan Empire recognized because they had watched it sign 100 imperial documents over 4 years. Seraphine Ashmore, Queen Designate of Valthari. In the throne room of the Lycan Empire, Vaelor Draven held the communique in his hand and read it 3 times. His face did not change. His breathing did not change. The Lord Commander Morn stood at his left shoulder and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The woman he had publicly destroyed had not run. She had not hidden. She had not appealed or pleaded or collapsed. She had walked out of his empire, crossed 3 days of open road, and married his greatest enemy. And in the margin of the communique, in the same clean dark ink, below her signature and above the official Valthari seal, she had written 4 words that were not protocol, not procedure, not any part of a formal document's required language. 4 words that no diplomatic tradition required or expected or could fully account for. 4 words that Vaelor would read every night for months in the particular darkness behind his eyelids when sleep wouldn't come. She had written, "I kept my word." Councillor Renwick entered the throne room at a near run, flushed and breathing hard, with a sheet of paper in his hand and an expression that Vaelor had never seen on him before, something that lived between alarm and the specific panic of a man who has just realized that the trap he set caught something much larger than he planned for. "Your Majesty," Renwick said, "there's something else, something that was delivered this morning to the Neutral Territories Council, a document packet. We're still verifying the contents, but our contact in the Council Secretariat says it references—" "What does it reference?" Vaelor's voice was very quiet. Renwick stopped. He looked at the paper in his hand. He looked at the king. "Everything," he said. The word everything hung in the throne room air like smoke after a fire, present, acrid, refusing to dissipate. Vaelor set the communique down on the arm of the throne with the careful, deliberate movement of a man who has decided that whatever his hands do in the next 30 seconds will be remembered. He looked at Renwick. He looked at the paper in Renwick's hand. He looked at the distance between them, which was about 15 feet, and which felt, in this particular moment, like something that could be crossed very fast. "Bring it here," he said. Renwick crossed the room and handed it over. Vaelor read it standing. He read it the way he read battlefield intelligence. Fast on the first pass for the shape of the thing, slow on the second for the details that changed the shape. He read it a third time because the second pass had produced something in his chest that he needed to verify wasn't a misread. It wasn't a misread. The document packet Seraphine had submitted to the Neutral Territories Council was 37 pages of indexed, sourced, and cross-referenced financial and diplomatic records. It did not accuse anyone. It did not make arguments. It simply documented with the meticulous precision of someone who had spent 4 years treating information as the only currency that couldn't be confiscated, the complete architecture of the High Council's shadow operations, the contract diversions, the manufactured border conflicts, the kickback network that ran through 6 noble houses and 3 external trading companies. The specific mechanism by which public funds designated for military provisioning had been redirected to private accounts over a period of 26 months. Every figure was sourced. Every source was verifiable. Every verification path led back to documents that existed in the official council record, which meant contesting it would require contesting the council's own paperwork. She hadn't just handed the Neutral Territories Council a weapon. She had handed them a complete instruction manual for using it. "How long," Vaelor said, "before this reaches the other houses?" Renwick's voice came out tight. "It may already have. The council secretariat doesn't operate on a delay protocol for how long? Hours, maybe less." Vaelor folded the intelligence report once and held it. The Lord Commander Morn had not moved from his position near the east wall. He was watching Vaelor with the expression of a man who has been in enough command situations to know when a decision is being made and when it has already been made and when the only remaining question is what category of damage is coming. "Aldrich," Vaelor said, "Your Majesty. How many of the High Council members named in this document are currently in the capital?" A pause. 6 of 9, Renwick, present. Lord Councillor Davon arrived yesterday from the northern provinces. Lady Councillor Marsh has been in residence since. 6 is enough. Vaelor set the paper on the throne and walked toward the door. "I want them assembled in the War Council chamber within the hour, not the council hall, the War chamber. And I want every exit from the building covered before the first one arrives." Renwick made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Vaelor stopped. He turned around slowly. He looked at Renwick the way he sometimes looked at a position on a battlefield map. Not with anger, with the particular cold assessment of someone calculating what a thing is worth and what it would cost to remove it. "You're in it," Vaelor said. Flat. Not a question. Renwick's face did something complicated. "Your Majesty, the accusations in that document are—" "You're in it," Vaelor said again. "Page 14. Fur contract diversions. The intermediary company is registered to your brother-in-law's holding entity in the Eastern Territories. I've read your financial disclosures. I know what his holding entity does and doesn't own." He paused. "You've been in my council chamber for 11 years. Renwick said nothing. "Aldrich." Vaelor didn't look away from Renwick. "Add him to the assembly list. Make sure he gets there." The Valthari Imperial Palace was built differently than the Lycan one. Seraphine had been briefed on this by the Eastern Border representative during the 3 days of travel, an efficient woman named Councillor Pren, who had delivered information in the same economical style as the letter that had started all of this, without decoration or condescension, in the tone of someone who assumes the person they're talking to is capable of handling facts. Valthari architecture prioritized function over display. The Great Hall was large but not ornate. The corridors were wide enough for 3 people to walk abreast because Cassian Thorne had apparently decided early in his reign that corridors designed to make visitors feel small were an inefficiency rather than an advantage. She noticed all of this the way she noticed everything: cataloging, filing, building a spatial understanding of the place she was now going to live in. The formal marriage ceremony had been brief and witnessed by the appropriate parties, and conducted without the particular theatrical weight that the Lycan court would have wrapped around it. Cassian Thorne had said the required words in a steady voice and looked at her directly when he said them, which she had noted because most men in his position would have been looking slightly past her, at the assembled witnesses, at the political statement being made, at the image of themselves making it. He had looked at her. She had looked back. Now it was the morning after, and she was in the strategy room that Counselor Pren had shown her the previous evening, and she was working. The room had a large central table covered in maps and a wall of shelving that held more organized reference material than she'd seen in most palace libraries. Someone had added a fresh set of documents to the table before she arrived. The most recent border intelligence reports and an economic summary of the territories adjacent to the Lycan Empire's eastern boundary. She hadn't asked for them. They had simply appeared, which told her something about how this place operated that felt important to hold on to. She was reading the third intelligence report when the door opened. Cassian Thorne was 33 years old and built like someone who had never had the option of not being physical. Not the decorative musculature of a court-maintained fighter, but the practical, functional build of a man who had spent a significant portion of his life in actual conditions. He was not as large as Vaelor. He was precise in a way that Vaelor was not. Each movement considered, nothing wasted. His eyes were a particular shade of gray that shifted toward green in certain light, and they were currently directed at the map she had been annotating. "You've been here since 5, he said. 4:30. He came to stand on the opposite side of the table. He looked at her annotations without comment for a moment. "You've marked the Sorthane passes. They're going to be a problem within 2 seasons. The structural integrity of the Northern Road. I know about the road. Then you know the supply line it supports is going to need a secondary route before winter, or you're going to have a provisioning gap in the northern garrison that will take 3 months to close." She looked up at him. "Do you have an alternative route mapped?" A pause. Something moved in his expression that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite assessment. "We're working on one. I'd like to see what you have." He studied her for a moment. Not the kind of studying that inventories, the kind that thinks. "You've been queen consort for approximately 14 hours. 15. And you're already... I'm doing what I'm here to do." She held his gaze steadily. "You offered me a seat at the strategic table. I'm sitting in it. If that's not what you actually intended, now is a better time to clarify than later." He looked at her annotations again. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "What do you know about the Sorthane alternative that we don't?" It wasn't quite an answer to what she'd said. It was better than an answer. It was a demonstration. She filed it. "The eastern bypass through the Greyvale lowlands is passable for supply wagons 8 months of the year if the drainage channels along the first 12 miles are maintained. Nobody has maintained them in 6 years because the territory governance changed hands twice in that period, and each new administration assumed the previous one had handled the infrastructure baseline. They didn't." She turned the map so he could read her notation without craning. "I know this because I spent 8 months trying to negotiate a joint maintenance agreement with your predecessor's border administration and Vaelor's territorial office simultaneously, and both of them declined because accepting would have required each party to formally acknowledge the other party's legitimate presence in the region." Cassian looked at the map. "That's an absurd reason to let a road rot." "Most things that break empires are absurd up close." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the palace was coming to its morning noise, boots in corridors, the distant sound of the practice yard, someone calling instructions across the courtyard below the window. The sounds of a working place. She was still cataloging them, adjusting her internal map of how this palace functioned. "The document packet you submitted to the Neutral Council," Cassian said. "Yes. You're aware that when it reaches the Lycan houses, and it will reach them, probably by now, The High Council is going to spend approximately 6 hours in damage control before they realize that the only exit from a documentation trap that thorough is to remove the person who built it. I'm aware. And you're comfortable operating here while that's the situation. She looked at him directly. I grew up in a house where my father's political enemies tried to have him removed from his governorship 3 times before I was 12. I learned to evaluate threats before I learned to ride. I'm comfortable operating anywhere I have accurate intelligence and a clear chain of command. She paused. Are you comfortable with a queen who operates like that? The question landed in the room and sat there. Cassian Thorne looked at her for a long moment with those gray-green eyes and the particular stillness of someone who isn't performing thought but actually doing it. Then he said, I married you because of how you operate. That would be a strange thing to then be uncomfortable with. She held that answer at arm's length mentally, examining it from multiple angles the way she examined intelligence reports. It seemed consistent with everything else she had observed in the last 72 hours. She was not yet ready to trust it fully. Trust was something she was going to build in this place brick by brick from demonstrated evidence, not inference, but she was willing to proceed as though it was what it appeared to be. Then I'll need access to your full border intelligence archive, she said, and a meeting with your military supply council before the end of the week. Done. He stood. And I want your read on the Greyville drainage situation in writing before the council meeting, something I can put in front of my engineering corps. She pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward her. I'll have it by midday. He moved toward the door and then stopped, his hand on the frame. He didn't turn around when he spoke. The Lycan Empire's grain reserve situation. You know what's coming? She set her pen down. The harvest projections for the Eastern Agricultural Territories have been running 15% below stated in the official reports for 3 years. Stated figures were inflated to avoid triggering the reserve mobilization protocols, which would have required High Council disclosure of reserve levels that don't match the recorded deposits. She paused. If this coming harvest comes in at actual yield rather than stated, the gap between real reserve levels and required provisioning will be visible in the public accounts within 2 months of harvest close. At that point, the political situation in the Lycan Empire becomes complicated. The pause that followed was brief. How complicated? Cassian said. The kind that creates opportunities, Seraphine said, for people who are positioned correctly and have already established themselves as stable alternatives. He turned then, and he looked at her across the room, and something in the quality of his attention changed, sharpened, recalibrated, the way a lens adjusts when the thing in front of it suddenly comes fully into focus. Write that down too, he said, all of it. I want it before midday. He left. She picked up her pen. The message arrived at the Valthari Palace 9 days after the Crimson Moon ceremony. It came through official diplomatic channels, which meant it had been routed through the Neutral Territories Council office and stamped with the appropriate clearances, which meant that whoever sent it had wanted it on record that it had been sent. That was itself information. Unofficial messages could be denied. This one was designed to be undeniable. It was addressed to Queen Consort Seraphine Ashmore Thorne. The name was new. She hadn't fully adjusted to it in writing yet, though she was precise about using it in every official context because precision in small things was how you built a position that couldn't be contested in large ones. She broke the seal in the strategy room, alone, in the late afternoon light that came through the western windows at a long angle this time of year, and turned everything the color of cooling embers. The letter was from Vaelor, not from the Lycan throne, from Vaelor. Personal heading, personal seal, handwriting she recognized across 3 feet of distance before she had consciously registered reading it. She read it standing. It was 12 lines. He had never been a writer. He communicated in person, in rooms, with his voice and his physical presence and the particular pressure of his attention. 12 written lines from Vaelor Draven represented an effort she understood the cost of, which she filed away without deciding yet what to do with it. The letter did not apologize. She hadn't expected it to. Apology required a particular kind of internal accounting that Vaelor had never, in 4 years, demonstrated the infrastructure for. What it did was something more unexpected. It stated in flat declarative sentences that the investigation of the High Council had produced preliminary findings consistent with the documentation she had submitted to the Neutral Council. that 6 counselors were currently under formal confinement pending a complete audit, that the audit was expected to take 3 months and would be conducted by an independent reviewing body. And then, in the last 3 lines, it said, "I want to meet. Neutral territory. Your terms for the location and attendance. I'm not asking to negotiate anything. I'm asking to talk." She read those last 3 lines 4 times. She thought about Renwick's face in the throne room the night of the Crimson Moon, the applause that had moved through the court like a wave, the specific sound of Vaelor's voice saying it's done in a register that had already closed the door on every alternative. She thought about standing in chandelier light, with her crown gone, and 300 people watching, and the single decision she had made in that moment that had governed every subsequent one. She would not let this break her into a shape that served someone else's purposes. She had kept that decision. She had kept it across 3 days of road travel and a brief formal marriage and 9 days of intensive work in a strategy room in a foreign palace, learning the particular texture of a different empire's problems. She had kept it by not looking backward, by treating every hour as a forward-facing problem, by refusing to spend her limited energy on the accounting of what had been done to her rather than the accounting of what she was going to do. The letter was pulling her backward. She set it down on the table. She walked to the window. The Valthari practice yard was visible from here. A dozen soldiers running a coordination drill in the fading light, moving with the synchronized efficiency of a unit that had trained together long enough to stop thinking about individual positions and start moving as a single organism. She watched them for a long time. The problem with Vaelor's letter was not what it asked. The problem was what it didn't say, which was the same thing it had never said in 4 years, the thing she had spent considerable energy not needing from him, because needing it had seemed like a structural weakness she couldn't afford. He had written 12 lines, and every one of them was controlled and measured and designed to communicate something specific, and not one of them said the thing that would have made the 12 lines mean what he seemed to want them to mean. He had not said, "I was wrong about you." Not because he couldn't write it, because he still didn't know if he believed it. The council investigation would tell him whether the documented evidence was real. The audit would confirm what she had already known was there. And at the end of 3 months of accounting, Vaelor Draven would have an answer to the factual question of whether she had betrayed the Lycan throne, and the answer would be no, and he would be standing in a throne room with that answer and the memory of tearing a crown off her head in front of 300 people and a letter he'd sent across international lines asking to talk. And she would still be here, in this strategy room, with her pen and her maps and a king who had looked at her across a table 9 days ago and said, "I married you because of how you operate." She picked up the letter again. She wrote her response in 10 minutes, in the same flat declarative style he had used, because mirroring someone's register was a way of speaking their language without conceding anything. She wrote, "I received your message. I note the council investigation and expect the audit findings will be consistent with the submitted documentation. I am not available for an informal meeting at this time. If you have specific matters requiring discussion, submit them through the Neutral Territories Diplomatic Office, and I will review them on the same basis as any other official correspondence." She signed it, Queen Seraphine Ashmore Thorne, Valthari Empire. She sealed it. She sent it. She went back to her maps. Dumped it. The knock at the strategy room door came 2 hours later, after the light had gone fully, and the servants had brought lamps, and she had been deep enough in the supply route analysis that the knock registered a full 3 seconds before her attention disengaged from the page. "Come in." It was Cassian. He was still in his day clothes, which meant he'd come directly from something rather than transitioning for the evening. He had a document in his hand and an expression she was beginning to recognize. The one where the controlled exterior had been pressured from inside, and the pressure was visible in the set of his jaw rather than his face. "We have a problem," he said. She set her pen down. "Tell me." He crossed to the table and laid the document flat. It was an intelligence report. She could identify the format at a glance now, after 9 days of reading Valthari intelligence documentation. This one had a priority designation at the top that she hadn't seen before. "The High Council members under confinement in the Lycan capital," Cassian said. 3 of them have requested asylum, not through the Neutral Council, directly to us." She looked at the report. She looked at him. They're trying to get out ahead of the audit. They want a deal. They're claiming they have information about a wider network, one that extends beyond the Lycan Empire. The room was very quiet. How wide? She said. That's what they want to negotiate. His jaw was tight. They've named 3 Valthari noble houses as participants. Seraphine went still. She went still the way she had gone still in the throne room on the night of the crimson moon. Complete, interior, the kind of stillness that looks like calm from the outside and is in fact the opposite of calm, is in fact the moment when every available cognitive resource redirects to a single point. She looked at the intelligence report and she thought about the network she had documented, the 37 pages she had submitted to the Neutral Council, which she had believed at the time represented the complete architecture of what she was dealing with. She had been wrong, not about the Lycan High Council, about the scope. What she had documented was not the full conspiracy. It was the visible surface of one. The corruption she had spent 4 years observing and 19 months quietly recording was not the end point. It was the local chapter of something that operated at a scale she had not, until this moment, had reason to suspect. She thought about the audit that was currently running in the Lycan capital. She thought about 3 council members under confinement asking for asylum in the empire governed by the woman who had built the case against them. She thought about the particular timing of Vaelor's letter, personal, off-channel, asking for an informal meeting, arriving 9 days after she had established herself here. She thought about what she knew and what she didn't know and the distance between those 2 things. Cassian, she said. Yes. We can't receive their asylum request through the standard channel. If we process this through the diplomatic office, it becomes a public record within 72 hours, and whoever is running the wider network will know within 72 hours that 3 of their people are talking to us. He looked at her. I know. We need a parallel channel, off the official record, something that gives us time to assess what they actually have before anyone outside this room knows they've approached us. She looked at the intelligence report. And we need to get word to Vaelor that the audit is bigger than what we submitted, before his people find it the wrong way. The silence between them had a different quality than the silences she had learned to read in 4 years of a different court, in a different empire. This one was not the silence of a man deciding whether to use information against you. It was the silence of someone running the same calculation she was running and arriving at the same answer. That means going through him directly, Cassian said. Not the diplomatic office. Yes. You just sent him a response telling him you'd only communicate through official channels. I know what I sent him. She met his gaze. I was wrong to send it. She said it without qualification, without the particular verbal scaffolding that people use to acknowledge being wrong without actually accepting it. She had been wrong. The letter had been a personal decision driven by a personal accounting that was not currently relevant, and she was going to correct it because the situation required correction, and there was no version of her that put personal accounting ahead of what was actually happening. Cassian studied her for a moment. What do you need? A courier I can trust, and access to your cipher system. She was already pulling paper toward her. And I need everything you have on the 3 Valthari houses they named. Everything. Tonight. He nodded once. He moved toward the door. Cassian. He stopped. If this network is as wide as their approach suggests, she paused, organizing the full shape of what she was about to say. This isn't a Lycan Empire problem, and it isn't a Valthari problem. It's going to require both thrones working from the same intelligence base. Or it won't matter which one of us exposes it first. They'll just relocate the pressure. He stood in the doorway with his hand on the frame, and she thought for a moment that he was going to say something diplomatic. Something that acknowledged the point without fully committing to it, the kind of response that bought time while positions were evaluated. He didn't. Write the letter to Vaelor, he said. I'll have the courier ready in an hour. He left. Seraphine set her pen to paper and began to write, and somewhere in the architecture of the moment, the lamplight and the maps, and the scratching of the pen, and the full weight of what was now set in motion, she understood that the line she had just crossed had no road back behind it. She was no longer maneuvering to survive what had been done to her. She was maneuvering to prevent something that had not yet happened to anyone. The woman who had walked out of the Lycan Empire 3 days after the Crimson Moon had been protecting herself. The woman writing this letter was doing something else entirely, and there was no version of either empire that would look the same when she was done. The courier left at midnight. Seraphine watched the light from his torch disappear through the Valthari Palace's eastern gate and then turned back to her maps because watching things disappear was not a productive use of the hours between now and when the response would come. She worked until the lamps burned low, slept 4 hours on the strategy room's narrow side couch rather than walking to her formal chambers, and was back at the table before the household staff had started on breakfast. Cassian found her there at 6 in the morning with the 3 Valthari house files spread across the table and her annotations running up the margins in the compressed shorthand she used when she was thinking fast. He set a cup of something hot near her elbow without comment. "House Aerith," she said without looking up. "The family seat is in the northeastern corridor, 20 miles from the border crossing at Calvin Gate. Their primary income source is listed as mining rights, but their recorded output hasn't matched their declared revenue for 4 years. The gap is too consistent to be accounting error." She tapped the page. "Someone is paying them for access, not product. Access." Cassian pulled out the chair across from her and sat. He looked at what she was reading. "We audited House Arath 2 years ago." "What did you find?" "Nothing actionable." "Because you were looking at the mining operation." She turned the file so he could see the page she'd marked. "The access isn't through the mine. It's through the private road network the family maintains under an old territorial charter, pre-Empire. That road system connects to 4 properties that changed hands in the last 6 years through intermediary holding companies that have no obvious connection to each other." She looked at him. 3 of those properties sit within a mile of courier relay stations. The silence that followed had weight. "They've been running a parallel communication network," Cassian said, "for at least 4 years, possibly longer." She sat back. "The 3 council members asking for asylum, they're not defecting because they're afraid of the Lycan audit. They're defecting because whatever the main network is planning, they've decided they don't want to be in the building when it happens." Cassian's jaw tightened. "That's a different level of fear than financial exposure." "Yes." He looked at the files. He looked at her. "How long before the courier reaches Vaelor?" "He'll arrive before nightfall today, if the road is clear. Response by tomorrow morning at the earliest." She picked up her pen. "We need to have a secure location selected for the 3 council members before then, somewhere not on the official record." "I'll handle it." He stood. "What do you need from me this morning?" "The full property registry for the northeastern corridor. And whoever runs your domestic intelligence operation, I want to talk to them directly." He nodded and left without making it complicated, which was something she was adding to her ongoing documentation of the ways this place operated differently than the place she'd come from. She went back to the files. She was 3 pages into the House Arath property registry when the knock came, not the door to the corridor, the connecting door to the small anteroom that adjoined the strategy room. The knock that meant palace staff, not visitors. "Come in." The attendant who entered was young, new, one of the household staff she hadn't fully cataloged yet. He carried a sealed note on a tray and kept his eyes down in the way of someone who had been trained to perform invisibility. "This arrived for you, Your Majesty. The courier said it was personal." She took it. She turned it over. No seal. No crest. Plain paper folded tight and closed with a wax strip that had been applied with a thumbnail rather than a seal ring. The kind of closure that left no identifying mark. She dismissed the attendant and opened it. The note was 6 lines. No signature. It said, "You submitted 37 pages to the Neutral Council. You kept the most important pages back. We know what you held in reserve. We know where you kept the copies. The copies no longer exist. Before you verify this, understand that we are offering you one opportunity to discuss terms. Send no couriers. Tell no one. Come alone to the Greyvale Market Town at the 3rd hour tomorrow night, or we will finish what we started at the Crimson Moon ceremony, and this time we will do it in a way that cannot be survived." She read it twice. She set it on the table. She breathed. The first thing she verified, internally, without moving, running the accounting through every detail she could access from memory, was whether it was possible, whether the copies could actually be gone. She had kept them in 3 separate locations, one in the personal document case she traveled with, one in a sealed packet deposited with Berold the innkeeper under a false name before she left the Lycan capital, one committed to memory in the cipher she had developed herself and never written down. The personal document case was in her formal chambers. She had not checked it this morning. She stood up. She walked to her chambers at a pace that was not running but was close. She opened the case. She went through it with both hands, systematic, every compartment. The sealed intersection was intact. The documents were there. She stood in the middle of her chambers and held the document packet in her hands and understood that the note was not a confirmed report. It was a test. They wanted to know if she would panic. They wanted to know if she would verify. They wanted to see what she did in the first 20 minutes after receiving it, because what a person does in the first 20 minutes after a threat is the most unguarded version of their response they will ever produce. She went back to the strategy room. She sat down. She picked up her pen. She went back to the property registry. She spent 11 minutes on the registry before she allowed herself to process the full content of what had just happened, because 11 minutes was enough time for anyone watching her to conclude that she had not been broken by the note, and not enough time to look like she was performing composure rather than having it. Then she set the pen down and thought. The note told her 3 things. First, there was someone inside this palace, not a distant external threat. The note had arrived through palace staff, carried by a courier who had apparently accessed the household delivery system without triggering any visible protocol. Someone had either bribed palace staff or had a contact embedded here. Second, the network she was dealing with had been watching her long enough and closely enough to know about the document reserve. She had never told anyone she held pages back. She had told no one, not even Cassian, because the reserve was a private insurance mechanism. The pages that named names not yet ready to be named, that documented transactions not yet fully traceable, that she had held because exposing incomplete evidence prematurely was sometimes more dangerous than exposing nothing at all. Third, they were scared of those pages, not of the 37 she'd submitted, of what she still held, which meant what she still held was worse than what she'd released. She had suspected that. She had not been certain until now. She was about to call for Cassian when the sound reached her. Not a shout, not a crash. The specific sound of rapid footsteps in a corridor that were trying not to be rapid. The sound of controlled urgency that military training produces when the training is fighting the instinct. She recognized it the way she recognized all the sounds of crisis that had accumulated in her experience over 4 years. Not because she had expected them, but because she had been paying attention when they came. The door opened. It was Pren, the border counselor. Her face was controlled, but her breathing was off. Your Majesty, there's been an incident at the northern gate. A pause. Vaelor Draven is here. Said. He had not sent a response through official channels. He had come himself with a 12-person escort, riding through the night, arriving at the Valthari northern gate at dawn, and requesting entry under his personal banner rather than the imperial standard. It was the kind of move that could have been interpreted as aggression, as desperation, or as the specific decision of a man who had received information that made the diplomatic protocol feel like a wall between him and something urgent. Seraphine met him in the outer receiving hall, not the formal throne room, not the strategy chamber cell. The outer receiving hall, which was large enough to be neutral, but not so formal as to impose a hierarchy that wasn't established. She had chosen it in the 3 minutes between Pren's notification and her arrival there. Cassian had been informed. He was in the adjacent room, close enough to be present if the situation required it, far enough to not make this into something it wasn't yet. Vaelor walked in, still carrying road dust on his coat. He looked like he hadn't slept. She had seen him without sleep before. It didn't diminish him physically. It compressed him, drew the exterior in tighter over whatever was happening inside. He scanned the room when he entered, clocked her position, clocked the exits, clocked the 2 Valthari guards near the far door, and then his attention settled on her and stayed there. She had seen that focus before, too. She had spent 4 years on the receiving end of it. The difference was that today she was standing in someone else's palace and wearing someone else's name, and the dynamic between that focus and her response to it had shifted in a way that she was still, if she was being precise about it, Not fully done processing. Seraphine, he said. Vaelor. She kept her hands still at her sides. You came quickly. I came when I understood what the message meant. He stopped 8 feet from her. Close enough to talk, far enough to make a point about not claiming proximity he hadn't been offered. Not what it said, what it meant. Tell me what you understood. His jaw shifted. He looked at her with that compressed inward focus and said, You sent me a warning, not intelligence. A warning. Which means you think whatever is coming for both of us, and you were willing to tell me that despite every reason you have to let it come for me alone. The accuracy of it landed without visible effect on her face. Sit down, she said. I'll have something brought. I don't need... Sit down, Vaelor. We have a lot to go through, and I need you functional. A pause. He sat. She sat across from him. The distance between them had a different texture than it had ever had before. Not the charged, complicated proximity of 4 years of partnership that had never been partnership. Not the formal remove of the throne room night. Something else. The specific distance of 2 people who have injured each other and are setting that fact aside because the thing in front of them is larger than the injury. She told him about the note. All of it, precise and sequential, the way she briefed any working council. She watched him listen. He was a good listener when he chose to be. Better than most people who held power, because most people who held power listened for confirmation of what they already knew rather than for information that would change what they knew. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. They have someone in this palace, he said. Yes. And in mine. The audit team found 2 embedded accounts in the provisioning office yesterday. People who have been in place for 3 years. His voice was flat. Long enough to watch everything. Long enough to know what we know before we know it. Seraphine absorbed this. They've been positioned inside both empires simultaneously. For at least 3 years, probably longer. He looked at her. The 3 counselors requesting asylum. Renwick talked before we transferred him to secure confinement. He didn't know how wide the network was. He knew he was one of multiple insertion points, but he didn't know the others. He described his contact as a relay, not a principal. Which means the principals aren't people we've named yet. No. She looked at the table surface. She thought about the pages she had held in reserve, the names on those pages, the transactions they documented, the pattern she had traced across 14 months of careful observation that had led her to understand that the Lycan High Council's corruption was not self-generated, but managed. Fed. Sustained by someone external with a long-term purpose that financial gain alone didn't explain. She had not submitted those pages to the neutral council because the pattern they pointed to was enormous enough that submitting it without proof of the principles would accomplish nothing except alerting the principals. She reached into the document case she had brought with her. She extracted the sealed packet. She set it on the table between them. Vaelor looked at it. That's what they want, she said. Those pages. Not the 37 I submitted. Those they can manage. What's in here they can't. What's in it? The principles. She held his gaze. 3 names, with full transaction chains, communication records, and property documentation. People who are not council members and not military officers, and not anyone whose public profile would suggest they had any operational involvement in what the council was doing. She paused. One of them is in the Neutral Territories Council itself. The silence that followed was the kind that required a moment to fully enter. If that's true, Vaelor started. The document package I submitted to the Neutral Council is sitting in an office run by someone who is part of the network it documents. She kept her voice level. Which means the only truly neutral authority we could have appealed to has already been compromised. Which means there is no external body currently capable of processing this without the principals being informed. Vaelor sat with that. She watched him process it the way she had always watched him process things. Physically, the information traveling through his body before it arrived in his decision-making. His shoulders set differently. Something went through his jaw. Then there's no channel, he said. No authority that isn't already inside this. There are 2 authorities, she said, this throne and yours, working from the same documentation base simultaneously through domestic judicial processes in each empire that the network doesn't control because they're too dispersed to have fully penetrated. Domestic process takes months. Some of it will. Some of it won't. She put her hand flat on the sealed packet. The network is planning something. The 3 counselors aren't defecting because they're afraid of an audit. They're defecting because they know what's coming and they don't want to be present for it. Whatever it is, it's timed. Probably to the moment when your grain reserve crisis becomes public, because that's when your throne is most vulnerable, and when a destabilized Lycan empire creates maximum opportunity for someone to... The window to her left exploded inward, not shattering, imploding, the glass fragmenting and driven inward by a concussive impact that rolled through the room a half-second after the glass moved, the physics of it wrong, backward, too fast. Seraphine was already moving before the sound finished registering. Instinct and 4 years of a court that had occasionally been genuinely dangerous driving her body sideways off the chair. The document packet in her hand because her hand had closed around it before she'd consciously decided to. Vaelor was across the table in a movement that shouldn't have been possible for a man his size, interposing himself between her and the broken window with the Alpha's bone-deep territorial reflex that operated faster than any strategic thought. His hand found her arm, not restraining, anchoring, and his eyes were already scanning the room with the specific focus of a man trained to assess threat geometry. The door burst open. Cassian came through it at speed with 2 Valthari guards behind him, sword drawn, taking the room in one sweeping assessment. His eyes went to the broken window, then to Seraphine, then to Vaelor, standing between Seraphine and the window, with his hand on her arm. Something moved across Cassian's face that was gone before she could fully read it. "North exterior wall," one of the guards was saying into the room behind him. 2. At least 2 moving toward the... Then the second impact came. This one was not a window. This one was structural, somewhere below and to the north, and it moved through the floor like a struck bell. The lamp swung. One went out. Seraphine looked at Vaelor. She looked at Cassian. She did the thing she had always done in the moments when everything was in motion, and the only stable point was what she knew rather than what was happening. "They're not trying to kill us," she said. Both men went still and looked at her. "If they wanted us dead, they would have done this differently. They want the packet." She held it up. "This is a retrieval operation. We're the obstacle, not the target." Cassian's eyes went to the packet. "What's in it?" "The names of the people who built the network that's been running both your empires from the inside for 3 years." She held his gaze. "Including someone in the Neutral Council." The silence lasted exactly 1 second. Then Cassian looked at Vaelor, and Vaelor looked at Cassian, and something passed between 2 Alpha Kings who had spent 3 years as territorial enemies, not alliance, not trust, not anything that had a name yet, but the specific recognition of 2 people who have simultaneously understood that the map they were using to navigate the last several years has just been revealed as someone else's fiction. The third impact hit the eastern wall. "We need a defensive position," Vaelor said. Not to Seraphine, not to Cassian, to the room, because the room was all of them now, and the people in it were the only ones currently working from correct information. Cassian was already moving. War room, sublevel, 1 entrance, no external walls. He looked at Seraphine. "Can you run?" She looked at him with the particular expression she reserved for questions that answered themselves. "Then stay between us," he said, and that was the last thing any of them said for a long time, because what came next wasn't a conversation. And as they moved through the corridor with the sounds of the palace erupting around them, guards shouting positions, boots on stone, the third impact still echoing in the walls, Seraphine held the document packet against her chest and understood with the complete, terrible clarity of a woman who had spent her entire life paying attention that what she had believed was a contained crisis between known parties was nothing of the kind. She had built her entire strategic position on the assumption that she knew the shape of what she was fighting. She had been wrong, and the people who knew she was wrong were currently inside the walls of the only place she had left to stand. The sublevel war room had 1 entrance and no windows and smelled of cold stone and old iron, and Seraphine understood within 30 seconds of entering it that whoever had designed the attack on the palace had known about this room. She understood it because the single entrance was the problem. 1 way in meant 1 way out, and the people currently moving through the Valthari Palace's upper levels were not there to retrieve a document from an open corridor. They were there to drive 3 specific individuals into the most defensible position available and then seal it. "This is a funnel," she said. Cassian was already at the room's central table, pulling the tactical map of the palace layout. 2 of his senior guards were at the door, swords drawn, listening to the sounds coming down the corridor. Vaelor had stationed himself to the left of the entrance with the particular physical economy of a man who has been in enough confined spaces to know exactly how much room he needs to operate effectively. "We have 12 men on the upper level," Cassian said without looking up. 8 at the perimeter wall. The attackers came over the north section. We had 4 guards there. We haven't had a count back on any of them." "They're not coming for a count," Vaelor said. "They cleared the north wall to establish an entry point. They've split. Part of the force is keeping your palace guard occupied at the perimeter while the rest are moving inward." He looked at the map. "How many internal corridors connect to this level?" 3. "We're watching 1. The other 2 are sealed by interior doors. Stone. Original construction. They require a key." "Who has the keys?" A pause. Cassian looked at the guard nearest him. The guard said, "The household master, the Lord Commander of the palace, and the key archive in the upper administrative office." Seraphine said, "The upper administrative office that is currently in the part of the palace the attackers came through." Nobody said anything for a moment. She looked at the map. She looked at the 2 sealed corridor positions and the one they were watching and the geometry of the room, and she ran the problem the way she ran every problem. Strip it to its essential structure, identify the variables that can be controlled, act on those first, and adapt to the ones that can't. "We can't hold this room," she said. "They want us to hold this room. The moment we commit to a defensive position in a sealed space with 1 exit, we've done their work for them." She looked at Cassian. "What's above the eastern sealed corridor?" He traced the map with 1 finger. "Storage level, then the outer kitchen building, then the eastern garden wall." "Which connects to the trade road?" "Yes." "Then we need that key." She looked at both men. "And we need to move before they reach the administrative office, or the key becomes irrelevant." Vaelor's eyes moved to her with the particular quality of attention she had learned to recognize in him. Not surprise, not calculation, the specific focus of a man who has just been given information that reorients his understanding of the current situation. In 4 years, she had seen it directed at battlefield maps and council reports, and the faces of people he was deciding how much to trust. He had never directed it at her quite like this. "You're talking about going through them," he said. "I'm talking about going around them while they expect us to be going through them." She looked at the guard near the door. "How fast can you get me to the administrative office through the servant corridor on the south side?" The guard glanced at Cassian. Cassian nodded once. 4 minutes if it's clear," the guard said. "Maybe 6 if it's not." "Go," she said. "I'll be right behind you." Vaelor said, "Seraphine, I know where the key archive is." She looked at him steadily. "You don't. Cassian's guard doesn't. I went through the full administrative orientation 2 weeks ago because that is what I do when I enter a new operational environment." She held his gaze for exactly the time it took to make the point without belaboring it. "Cover the entrance." She went. The servant corridor was narrow and dark and smelled of cleaning materials and the specific dusty cold of a passage that gets used for function rather than presentation. The guard moved in front of her at a controlled pace that was just short of running, listening at each junction before committing to the turn, and she stayed 2 steps behind him and kept the document packet pressed against her side with her left arm, and kept her right hand free, because in a confined space, a free hand was the only thing between a bad situation and a worse one. The sounds from the upper level had changed, less concussive, more directional. The movement of a specific number of people through specific spaces rather than the broad percussive impact of the initial assault, which meant the outer force had done its job and the inner team was now working. She counted the time in her head. 3 minutes to the administrative level. 1 minute for the archive, 4 minutes back. If the southern corridor stayed clear. The southern corridor did not stay clear. The guard in front of her stopped hard at the junction before the administrative stairs, 1 fist back at her. "Stop. Freeze." She pressed against the wall and went silent and listened. Boots. Above them, at the administrative level, more than 2 people, moving with coordination, not searching, moving with purpose, which meant they already knew where they were going, which meant they had a floor plan, which meant the embedded contact inside the palace had given them a floor plan. She thought about the note that had arrived that morning on the plain paper with the thumbnail seal. She thought about the attendant who had delivered it with his eyes down in the way of someone trained to perform invisibility. She thought, not trained to perform invisibility, actually invisible, actually embedded, actually there for exactly this. The guard looked back at her. His eyes asked the question his voice couldn't. She held up 2 fingers, pointed up, pointed left, held up 3 fingers. He understood. 2 people above, approach from the left, give her 3 seconds. He went around the corner, she counted. At 3 she followed. What happened in the stairwell took 11 seconds and was not something she would later be able to reconstruct with any narrative coherence. It was pure physical present tense, the compressed chaos of a confined space with too many bodies and too much intent. The guard engaging the first attacker with a controlled efficiency that spoke of genuine training. The second attacker pivoting toward her because she was the smaller target and therefore the assumed easier one. The specific moment when that assumption encountered the reality of a woman who had spent 4 years in a court where being underestimated was the primary survival condition and had stopped being surprised by it approximately 18 months in. She got past him. That was the part that mattered. The how of it left a bruise across her left forearm that she wouldn't fully register until later. The administrative office was empty. She went straight to the archive. A locked cabinet on the north wall, key kept on the inside of the decorative panel above it, in the position she had noted during the orientation because noting things like that was the baseline she had operated from since she was 12 years old. She had the key in her hand in 40 seconds. She was back in the corridor in 50. The guard met her at the stairwell bottom. He was bleeding from a cut above his left ear and moving functionally, which was the only status report that mattered right now. She showed him the key. He moved. They made it back to the war room in 5 minutes. Mokchan. The eastern corridor door opened into a low stone passage that smelled of the earth above it and angled upward at a grade that became uncomfortable after the first 100 feet. Seraphine went through it behind the lead guard with Cassian directly behind her and Vaelor at the rear, and she heard rather than saw the sounds of the war room entrance being tested, not yet breached, but tested, before the door closed behind them and cut the sound off. The passage was tight enough that Vaelor's shoulders brushed both walls. She kept moving. Her mind was running 2 parallel processes, immediate navigation and the larger problem, the thing that the attack had confirmed in a way that no document submission or diplomatic correspondence could have. The network was not waiting for the grain crisis to move. It was moving now, which meant either the timeline had accelerated or there was a trigger she hadn't identified, something that had happened in the last 72 hours that told the principals that their window was closing. The courier. She had sent a courier to Vaelor last night with a message that described in cipher the scope of what she was looking at and the name she was holding in reserve. She had sent that courier through the Valthari Palace's standard routing system because the off-record channel she had wanted to establish was still being arranged at the time she sent it. The courier had gone through the standard system, which had an embedded contact, who had read the cipher, or had reported the departure of an unusual late-night courier to someone who could read the cipher, and had passed the information up the chain within hours. She had triggered this by sending that letter. She worked through this without breaking her stride in the passage, because breaking stride was a response to guilt, and guilt was a resource she could not currently afford. What mattered was not that she had triggered it, but what triggering it told her about the network's state. They had been watching closely enough and had people positioned thoroughly enough that an off-schedule courier departure at midnight was sufficient to initiate a full asset deployment within 1 day. That level of readiness did not exist in an organization that was operating from a position of strength and patience. That level of readiness existed in an organization that was already in motion and looking for a reason to commit. They were already in motion. Whatever they were planning, it was not in the planning stage. The passage opened into the storage level. Low ceilings, crates stacked against 3 walls, a single lamp burning on a bracket near the far door that gave the space the dim reddish light of something barely maintained. The lead guard went through first, verified the space, waved them through. Cassian stopped at the center of the room. She stopped 2 steps ahead of him. Vaelor came through the passage last and straightened to his full height, in the first place wide enough to allow it. "They're already moving," Seraphine said. She said it to both of them because the information belonged to both of them equally, and treating it as belonging to one of them would cost time they didn't have. "This attack wasn't triggered by what I submitted to the Neutral Council. It was triggered by my courier last night." She looked at Cassian. "Your standard routing system has an embedded contact." His jaw tightened. "Noted." The network was already in an active deployment phase before tonight. This was not a reaction to a threat. This was a reaction to a threat that was about to name them publicly. The difference is significant. She looked at the sealed packet in her hand. "They don't know what's in here. They know it exists and they know it names the principles. They don't know whether we've shared its contents with anyone else." "Have we?" Vaelor said. "No." He nodded once. "Then as long as they don't know whether copies exist, they won't kill us. Because killing us without first confirming there are no copies means the copies surface anyway and they've spent their asset deployment for nothing." "That's correct." She met his gaze. "Which gives us a window." "How wide?" "Not wide." She looked at the far door. "Wide enough?" Cassian said. "What do you need?" She thought for a single concentrated moment, organized the variables, ran the dependencies, identified the 3 actions that could change the shape of what was currently happening rather than merely responding to it. "I need a secure line to the Neutral Territories Council Secretariat's Deputy Director." "Not the Director, the Deputy." "Ardal Fenn." "He's been working under the Compromised Director for 6 years, and he's been building a separate record of discrepancies in the Council's handling of sensitive submissions for 3 years because he knew something was wrong but didn't have the shape of it. He'll take a direct contact if it comes from a recognized Imperial authority." Cassian looked at her. "You know the Deputy Director of the Neutral Territories Council by name." "I know everyone who has been quietly building a case against their own organization for 3 years." She held his gaze. "That is the category of people I pay the most attention to." She turned to Vaelor. "Your domestic judicial council, who runs it?" "Lord Justice Carvin." A pause. "She's not in the network. I'd stake the throne on it." "Why?" "Because they tried to remove her 4 years ago, and she fought it through the public record and won. She's made enemies of every person on that list." His voice was flat. "She's been running independent audits of the Council's contract decisions on her own authority for 2 years. I knew about it. I didn't know why. Now you know why." She looked at him. "Get her a copy of this." She held up the packet. "Tonight. Through a personal courier, you select yourself from outside the normal household rotation." He took the packet from her. He looked at it and then at her. "If this gets to Carvin," he said, "it's done. She'll have arrest warrants issued within 24 hours. That's the point. It means there's no negotiation after. Whatever they were going to offer us to stand down, that window closes." "I'm aware." He looked at her for a moment longer than necessary, which she recognized as him confirming something in her face that he needed to be sure of before he committed to the next action. She held still and let him look. "All right," he said. The far door burst open. 3 men came through in a combat formation. Not palace guards, not anyone in a recognizable uniform, dressed in the dark, nondescript clothing of people who travel without announcing intent. They had covered the kitchen building and the storage level access faster than anyone in the passage had calculated because they had the floor plan, and they had running start, and they had known exactly where the eastern corridor opened. The first one targeted Cassian. The second and third split toward Vaelor and Seraphine respectively. Vaelor moved to intercept the third before he reached her, and what followed in the storage room had the compressed brutality of genuine violence in a confined space. Nothing controlled, nothing presented. Just the raw, ugly physics of bodies in collision with intent behind them. Vaelor took a hit across the right shoulder that would have dropped a smaller man and drove through it with the single-minded momentum of someone who has decided that damage is not currently an acceptable excuse to stop. He was bleeding from somewhere on his face by the time the third attacker went down, and she couldn't tell if it was from the hit or from the stone wall his opponent had driven him into. Cassian had handled the first man with the systematic efficiency of someone who had learned to fight from instructors who had no interest in producing anything beautiful. He was breathing hard when it was done. The second attacker had gone for Seraphine and had gotten 2 steps before the lead guard put him on the ground from behind. The storage room was breathing hard. Everyone in it was bleeding from something. Seraphine looked at Vaelor. His right shoulder was set wrong. Not broken, she thought, but something pulled or compressed, the way he was compensating for it with his left side already adjusting. He was not going to say anything about it. She knew that without asking. "We need to move," Cassian said. His voice was level because he was making it level. The kitchen building and then the garden wall. "Vaelor!" She crossed to him. She put her hand on his left arm, not the injured side, the functional one, and she looked at his face at close range for the first time since the throne room 3 weeks ago. The road dust was there, and the blood now, and the particular compression she had described to herself in the war room as having no sleep behind it. He looked back at her. She said quietly, "Can you move?" "Yes." "Fast?" "Yes." "Then let's go." She released his arm. She looked at Cassian. Garden wall. They went. The kitchen building was empty and smelled of banked fires and the cold fat of an interrupted morning, and they moved through it at speed that didn't allow for much beyond forward momentum and the ongoing sound calculation of where the threat was relative to where they were. Seraphine's left forearm was burning properly now, the bruise resolving into pain with the specificity of an injury that had been waiting for the adrenaline to thin before announcing itself. She noted it and kept moving. The garden wall was 10 feet of old stone with a gate that the lead guard got open on the second attempt. The trade road beyond it was empty in the early morning light, the particular gray gold of a dawn that hadn't committed yet. The road stretching north toward the city and south toward the border crossing at Kelvin Gate and the neutral territories beyond it. They came through the gate and stopped. Cassian looked south. Vaelor looked north. Seraphine looked at both of them and at the road and at the document packet still in Vaelor's hand, and she ran the calculation one final time with everything currently available to her. The packet needed to reach Carvin, Vaelor's domestic judicial council, his own justice lord who had been quietly building a case for 2 years, the man who could issue warrants that didn't depend on any authority that had already been compromised. To get the packet to Carvin, Vaelor needed to get back to the Lycan capital. Tonight. And there was something else. Something that had been organizing at the edge of her processing since the stairwell, since the storage room, since the moment Vaelor had moved to intercept the third attacker before he reached her without any calculation or hesitation, the way the body does things that the mind hasn't caught up to yet. She looked at Vaelor. He was looking at her already. She said, "Carvin needs to move simultaneously with Fen at the Neutral Council and with Cassian's domestic judiciary. If any one of them moves first, the network has time to alert the others. It has to be concurrent." She paused. "Which means we need a coordination signal, something all 3 of them recognize as the moment to act." "What signal?" Cassian said. She looked at the road. She looked at the eastern horizon where the dawn was making its first actual commitment to the day. She looked at 2 kings standing on either side of her on a trade road outside a palace that was still working out which of its occupants were loyal, and she understood with the specific clarity that arrives in moments when everything unnecessary has been stripped away by extreme circumstances that the signal was not the problem. The problem was what came after the signal. Because the network, the 3 principles, the embedded contacts, the entire architecture of managed corruption that had been running both empires from the inside, had one final resource she had not yet accounted for. The intelligence report in Cassian's war room, the one with the priority designation she hadn't seen before. She had not finished reading it. She had been interrupted by the note on the plain paper and had not gone back. She looked at Cassian. "The intelligence report, the priority one. What was the second half?" He went very still. That stillness told her. "Cassian." Her voice was quiet. "What was in the second half of that report?" He looked at her with the gray-green eyes that shifted in certain light, and she watched him make a decision that cost him something. And she understood in the moment before he spoke that whatever he was about to say was the thing that changed the shape of everything she had built over the last 3 weeks. The network's final objective, he said, it wasn't destabilization. It wasn't financial extraction. He paused. It was replacement. The word landed in the empty morning air. Both thrones, he said, simultaneously. They've had candidates positioned for 18 months. People who would step into power in a destabilized succession crisis and appear as stabilizing forces. He looked at the document packet in Vaelor's hand. The grain reserve crisis in the Lycan Empire. They manufactured it, not just inflated the numbers. They've been systematically diverting the actual grain surplus to external storage under false export documentation for 26 months. When the crisis hits, it will be real. And the candidate they have positioned is already in place at the Lycan court, presenting himself as a reform voice. Vaelor's hand tightened on the packet. Seraphine looked at him. She watched the information travel through his body the way information always did. The shoulder shift, the jaw, the specific quality of stillness that in Vaelor Draven meant the space between understanding and deciding had just collapsed to nothing. Who? He said. Cassian said a name. And Vaelor Draven, who had torn a crown from a woman's head in front of 300 people without flinching, who had ridden through the night across international borders without an official embassy, who had taken a hit in a stone-walled storage room and kept moving, stood on a trade road in the early morning light and looked like a man who had just understood what it cost to be wrong about the people you trusted. The person Cassian named was the one man Vaelor had protected from the council investigation, the one he had believed was clean. "We move now," Seraphine said. Her voice was steady because one of them needed to be, and she had been doing this longer than either of them. Not fighting, not commanding, but the specific work of holding the operational shape of a crisis together when the crisis keeps changing shape. "Vaelor, how fast can you reach the capital?" He looked at her. Something in his face had stripped back to the bone. "Fast enough," he said. "Then go." She stepped toward him and held out her hand for the packet because the packet needed to be split now. Copies made, routes divided, the information distributed across enough channels that no single point of failure could suppress it. "Leave 3 men with us. Take the rest." He put the packet in her hand. Their fingers were in contact for a half-second, and she felt the dried blood on his knuckles, and the faint tremor in his hand that was not fear, was the body's accounting of damage taken, and she looked at his face, and he looked at hers, and the air between them had the weight of everything that had been said and unsaid and done and undone over 4 years and 3 weeks and one very long night. He said, "Seraphine." She said, "I know." She didn't know fully. She wasn't sure he did either. But there was a road in front of them, and names to deliver, and warrants to issue, and an empire being hollowed out from the inside by people who had bet everything on the assumption that the individuals at the top of it were too busy protecting their pride to notice what was happening at the foundation. That bet was about to cost them everything. "Go," she said. He went. She turned back to Cassian, and she looked at him in the growing light, and he looked at her. And between them was the specific, complicated silence of 2 people who have just been through something that has changed the weight of every word they might say next. And neither of them said anything at all yet, because the next step was not words. The next step was the signal. And the signal required getting back inside that palace, through the people who were still moving through it, to the one communication line that connected to Ardal Fen at the Neutral Council Secretariat, and to Lord Justice Carvin in the Lycan capital, and to Cassian's own judicial office simultaneously. 1 line, 1 moment, 3 warrants. And somewhere in the building behind them, the network's embedded contact was still active, still watching, still connected to the 3 principals who were even now calculating whether their asset deployment had been successful and whether the document packet was contained. It was not contained. And when the signal went out, they would know it. What happened next would not be a retrieval operation. Seraphine looked at the palace wall. She looked at Cassian. "Tell me there's a second way in," she said. He looked at the wall. He looked at her. "There's a second way in," he said. She breathed once, clean and full. "Then let's finish it," she said. The second way in was a drainage channel cut into the palace's eastern foundation wall, wide enough for one person moving sideways, smelling of groundwater and old iron and the specific mineral cold of stone that hasn't seen light in 100 years. Cassian went first. Seraphine followed. The two guards Vaelor had left came last, and the four of them moved through the dark with their hands against the wet stone and the sounds of the palace above them filtering down through the foundation like something heard underwater. She counted the distance in her head. 40 feet. 60. The channel angled upward and she felt the incline in her calves and kept moving. The channel opened into the palace's sub-basement utility corridor, another low-ceilinged space, this one with proper lamp brackets, though only half of them were lit, casting a yellow light that made everyone's faces look like they'd been carved from something unhealthy. Cassian stopped at the junction and listened for 30 seconds. She listened with him. The sounds from above had changed again. Less movement, more position. The attackers had consolidated somewhere. Communication room is 2 levels up, he said quietly. North side. They'll have someone on the main stairwell. Servant stairs. On the south, yes. He looked at her. It's a longer route. Longer is fine. Direct is not. He nodded. He moved. They took the servant stairs 1 level at a time, pausing at each landing long enough to verify the corridor before committing to the next flight. The palace had gone to a particular kind of quiet that Seraphina recognized from the Lycan court during its worst nights. The quiet that isn't absence of activity, but presence of held breath. Everyone who wasn't part of the conflict having found a room with a locked door and decided to wait. She had locked a lot of doors herself over the years. She understood the instinct, and she had stopped doing it somewhere around the 14th month of her Luna tenure, because she had learned that locked doors were only safety if the thing you were afraid of was on the outside. The communication room was a long, narrow space on the north side of the second level with a bank of relay equipment along the inner wall and 2 chairs that looked like they had not been chosen for comfort. One of Cassian's communication officers was already there, a small, sharp-faced woman named Drev, who had clearly been waiting for someone with authority to walk through the door and tell her what to do, and who reorganized her entire expression when Cassian came through it. "I need 3 simultaneous connections," Cassian said. He didn't sit down. Neither did Seraphine. Ardal Fen at the Neutral Council Secretariat, Lord Justice Carvin at the Lycan Judicial Council, and our own Domestic Justice Office, Director Malin's personal line. Drev was already at the equipment. "Sir, the main relay has been... Someone cut the primary line from the exterior junction box. Secondary. Functional. I've been routing through it." She looked at the wall of equipment with the particular assessment of someone whose entire competence lives in these machines. 3 simultaneous will be slow. The secondary has half the bandwidth. "Then we go one at a time, fastest first." He looked at Seraphine. "Who do you trust most to hold?" She thought for exactly the time the question required. "Carvin? She's been building toward this for 2 years. She'll move the moment she has the documentation, and she won't wait for confirmation from anyone above her because there is no one above her on this that she trusts." She looked at Drev. "Fen second. He'll need 10 minutes to verify the packet contents before he acts. But once he starts, he won't stop." She paused. "Malin last. Your domestic office is the one I know least." Cassian said, "Malin is clean. She's been in that role for 8 months. Appointed after her predecessor resigned under circumstances I am now understanding differently than I did at the time." "Then Malin, last and brief." Seraphine looked at the communication equipment. "How long to raise Carvin?" 3 minutes to establish," Drev said, "if she's at her office." "She will be. It's not yet midday." She looked at Cassian. "Copies of the packet." He had already pulled the document case from the guard, who'd carried it through the drainage channel, and was extracting sheets in organized groups. Not random, precise, the copies she had prepared in the original organization that made the evidence chains legible to someone encountering them cold. He was fast about it, hands moving with the efficiency of someone who has handled a lot of documents under pressure, and she watched him divide the packet into 3 equal copies with the core evidence pages duplicated across all 3. She watched his hands and thought about the 14 months she had spent watching a different man's hands in a different court and understanding what a person revealed in the way they handled the work in front of them when they thought the quality of their attention was not being observed. Cassian handled every sheet like it mattered. She looked away and looked at the relay equipment and kept her breathing even. "Carvin's line is ringing," Drev said. Tab. Lord Justice Carvin had a voice like gravel in a metal pan. Abrasive, immediate, not a single syllable wasted on performance. Who is this? Seraphine Ashmore Thorne, Queen Consort of Valthari. A pause that she did not fill with anything softening. You've been running independent audits of the Council's contract decisions for 2 years. I know what you've been looking for. I have it. The silence on the other end lasted 4 seconds. In Seraphine's experience, a 4-second silence from someone like Carvin was not hesitation. It was the sound of a very fast mind running a very fast verification. What do you have? Carvin said. 3 principles. Full transaction chains. Communication records authenticated against Council documentation already in your archive. She looked at Cassian. He held up the copy she had designated for Carvin. I'm transmitting the packet now through the Valthari secondary relay. You'll have it in full within the hour. I need warrants issued before the end of the day. On 3 principles. Yes. Names. She gave them. All 3, clear and sequential, the way she gave every important piece of information. Without preamble, without cushioning, because cushioning was what you did when you weren't sure the information was right, and she was certain. Another silence. Longer this time. 7 seconds. I know 2 of those names, Carvin said. The 3rd I will want to verify before... The 3rd is the reason your verification attempts over the last 18 months have been running into closed doors, Seraphine said. He controls 2 of the document access points you've been trying to reach. The verification trail is in the packet, page 19 onward. A breath on the other end. Short, controlled, the breath of someone recalibrating. King Draven is aware of this, Carvin said. It wasn't a question. He left for the capital 2 hours ago. He will contact you directly before he arrives. The person you named to him is already under specific watch. Do not move on the others until Draven reaches you, or you risk alerting the network through his contact's embedded position. Understood? Another pause. Why are you giving this to me rather than the Neutral Council? Because the Neutral Council has been compromised at the directorial level. She kept her voice level. Your jurisdiction is domestic. You don't need their authority to issue these warrants. The silence this time was different. It had the texture of pieces connecting. Send the packet, Carvin said. I'll have the warrants drafted before I finish reading it. The line went to static. Seraphine exhaled once. She looked at Drev. Fen. Fen took 11 minutes to verify the core evidence chain, which was 8 minutes faster than she'd estimated, and issued a formal sequestration notice on the Neutral Council Director's access to the submitted documentation within 40 seconds of completing his verification. He was precise, professional, and clearly furious in the specific contained way of a person who has spent 3 years watching something wrong happen in an institution they have given significant portions of their life to, and who is now holding the proof of it in their hands. He said, before the line closed, the original submission you made, the 37 pages. I want you to know they were never actually processed. The director had them flagged for review delay 2 days after receipt. They've been sitting in an access-restricted folder. She had suspected this, knowing it landed differently than suspecting it. Ben, she said, when your notice goes through, the director will know within the hour. I'm aware. He'll contact someone. I'm aware of that too. A pause. I've been preparing this sequestration notice for 6 weeks. It has copies routing to 7 independent oversight positions simultaneously. By the time he tries to contact anyone, there will be 7 people already acting on what I've sent. She felt something shift in her chest. Not relief. Too early for relief. But the specific feeling of a load being shared by more hands than you'd planned for. Thank you, she said. Thank you, he said, and meant it differently, and the line closed. Drev was already raising Malin. The attack on the communication room came at the 50-minute mark. 2 people through the door at once. She heard them before the door opened, the weight distribution of people about to move fast, and she was already stepping back from the relay equipment when the first one came through. Cassian intercepted the second. The guards handled the first. The room was very small and the noise in it was substantial for about 30 seconds. When it was over, Seraphine was standing by the relay equipment with a cut on her right palm from the edge of the desk she'd used to redirect the first attacker's forward momentum, and Cassian was breathing hard against the wall with his hand pressed to his left side where he'd caught someone's elbow at a bad angle. "How bad?" she said. "Nothing structural." He breathed through it. "You're bleeding." She looked at her hand. She looked at the relay equipment. Drev was on the floor behind the equipment bank where she'd gone when the door opened, unhurt, watching them with wide eyes. "Is Malin connected?" Seraphine said. Drev looked at the equipment. "Yes." "She's been holding." Seraphine crossed to the relay. She pressed the connection. "Director Malin, this is Queen Consort Seraphine Ashmore Thorne. Apologies for the delay. We had a situation." She looked at her bleeding hand without expression. "I'm going to give you 3 names and a packet reference. I need your domestic warrants active before nightfall. Can you do that?" Malin's voice was younger than she'd expected, steadier than the situation warranted. "Yes," she said. "Tell me," Chet gabbed. The warrants went out at the 2-hour mark. Not simultaneously, Carvin moved first, 40 minutes ahead of Fenn's sequestration notice, because Carvin had been ready for 2 years and did not need 40 minutes to draft 3 warrants when she had been mentally drafting them since the audit records first showed her what she was looking at. Fenn moved second. Malin moved third, her warrants the narrowest in scope, but the cleanest in jurisdiction because the Valthari Domestic Judicial Office had the least contamination of the 3 channels. By the time the 3 principal names were formally under warrant across 2 empires and 1 international oversight body, it was early afternoon. In the Lycan capital, Vaelor Draven arrived at Lord Justice Carvin's office 4 hours after leaving the Valthari trade road, rode through the capital gate without stopping at protocol, went directly to the judicial building with road dust still on his coat and blood dried on the side of his face that he had not stopped to address because addressing it would have cost time. He read Carvin's drafted warrants standing at her desk. He signed them with his own seal, which made them imperial orders rather than judicial recommendations, which closed the last procedural gap that any of the 3 principals' lawyers might later have tried to use as an exit. The man Cassian had named, the one Vaelor had protected from the initial council investigation, the one he had believed was clean, was arrested at his townhouse in the capital's administrative district at 3 in the afternoon while he was in the middle of composing a message to an address that Carvin's investigators would spend the next 6 weeks fully tracing. He did not resist. He was, by all accounts, very pale. Vaelor stood in Carvin's office after the arrest confirmation came through and looked at the wall for a long time. Carvin had the intelligence to leave him alone with it. He was thinking about a man he had known for 9 years. He was thinking about the specific texture of misplaced trust, not the dramatic kind, not the kind that comes with warning signs you missed, but the ordinary kind. The kind built from 100 ordinary interactions that gave you no reason to look closer because there was nothing visible to look at. He was thinking about the cost of that, not in political or strategic terms, but in the simpler and harder terms of what it meant that the thing he'd been most wrong about wasn't Seraphine. It was himself, his own capacity to see clearly. The thought sat with him the way things sat when they were true enough to refuse to be moved. He had torn a crown from a woman's head because people he trusted had told him to, and he had chosen to believe them rather than to believe 4 years of direct evidence. He had stood in a chandelier-lit hall in front of 300 people and made a public declaration that was wrong in every material fact, and he had known, somewhere below the level of conscious decision-making, in the place where you know things you're not ready to look at, that he was doing it because the alternative was admitting that his own court had managed him, that the most feared Alpha King alive had been played by the people he kept closest. The pride of that admission had cost more than the throne could afford. He had known it then. He had let it happen anyway. Carvin came back in after 20 minutes with 2 cups of something and put one on the desk near him without comment, which was the most useful thing anyone could have done. "The other 2 principals are in custody," she said. "The Neutral Council director is being held by Fenn's oversight office pending formal transfer to international jurisdiction." She sat down. She looked at her papers. "The network's embedded contacts within both palace systems are being identified and removed. It will take time. We have confirmation of 7 so far, and there are likely more. How long for full scope? 3 months minimum, 6 to be thorough. She looked at him over the desk with the directness of a woman who had spent 20 years in the legal structures of power and had developed a comprehensive immunity to performing anything she didn't feel. Your empire is going to go through a difficult period. The grain reserve situation is real. They manufactured the crisis, but they used real mechanisms, and the actual supply shortfall will need to be addressed. I know. The noble houses that participated in the kickback network will contest their exposure. Some of them have enough independent resources to sustain a legal fight for years. I know that too. And the political capital you spent at the Crimson Moon ceremony will not be recovered quickly. The court's perception of Carvin. He looked at her. I know all of this. Tell me what I don't know. She held his gaze. The grain shortfall can be addressed through emergency procurement from 3 neutral territory suppliers if the contracts are initiated within the next 2 weeks. I have the contact information. She paused. The noble house situations can be managed if you establish an independent accountability body with public reporting requirements. It removes the individual legal fights and replaces them with a systemic process that's harder to contest. Another pause. And the political capital issue is not about what you say in the next 6 months, it's about what you do. She looked at her desk. That's what I know. He nodded once. He picked up the cup she'd brought and drank from it and set it down and looked at the warrant copies on her desk with his seal pressed into the wax at the bottom. And he thought about a woman standing at the top of a staircase in charcoal and silver who had already known something was wrong when she crossed the hall toward him, who had watched him perform certainty he didn't have, and had looked at him and said, "Don't do this," and then had not begged, had not broken, had walked out and built something from the wreckage that was now holding up the structure of an investigation that was saving empires. She had every reason to let fall. He said, "I need to go back." Carvin looked at him. "To Valthari," he said. "There are things that can only be said in person." She looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a woman who understands people's motivations as a professional requirement. "Is that strategic," she said, "or personal?" He considered lying. He'd been doing a lot of that, he realized. Not to other people, but to himself, and the cost of it was currently itemized in the accounting he'd been doing for the last 4 hours. "Both," he said. She nodded. "Then go. I can manage what's here." Chats. The Valthari Palace took 3 days to fully clear. Seraphine spent most of those 3 days working. The supply route analysis she'd been doing before the attack, the Eastern Corridor drainage documentation for the Engineering Corps, the detailed brief on the grain reserve situation she had drafted for Vaelor's judicial office at Carvin's request. She worked in the strategy room because the strategy room was where the work was, and she had not spent 4 years learning to focus through adverse conditions in order to stop when the conditions became worse than average. Cassian moved through those 3 days with the particular contained intensity of a man managing a palace-wide security review, while also managing a political situation that had revealed multiple embedded contacts in his own household and required simultaneous coordination with 2 foreign judicial systems. He stopped at the strategy room door twice daily, morning and evening, not always with conversation, sometimes just to confirm she was there and functional and had what she needed, which she found was a form of check-in she appreciated more than she would have predicted. On the second day, he came in and sat across from her at the table without preamble. "The network's full scope," he said. "Preliminary count. 23 embedded contacts across both palaces and 3 neutral territory offices, operational for between 2 and 6 years each." He looked at the table. "The longest-running one was in my kitchen. Been there 5 years." She thought about the attack, the timing of it, how fast they had been. "Who interviewed her first?" she said. "Pren." "Good." She picked up her pen. "She'll talk. The kitchen staff position means she's a relay, not a principal. She has information but limited authority within the network, which means she has reason to cooperate for reduced exposure." She looked at him. "Make sure whoever does the formal interview understands her structural position before they go in. If they treat her like a principal, she'll close down and you'll lose the relay information." He was quiet for a moment. "You've been doing this a long time," he said. "Understanding how organizations work." She kept writing. "Yes." not just organizations. He was watching her in the particular way he had, not the inventory, not the assessment, something that had been developing over the 3 weeks she'd been here that she was being careful not to name too quickly, because naming things prematurely was how you made errors about them. People, how they fit into structures, what they'll do under pressure. She looked up. "I've been doing that since I was 12, she said. "It's the first useful skill my father taught me." "Did he teach you what to do with the information once you had it?" She held his gaze. "He taught me to hold it carefully. That information used wrong is worse than information not used." She paused. "Most of what I held over 4 years in the Lycan court, I never used. Not because I couldn't, because the right moment and the right purpose never aligned until they took the crown." He looked at her for a long moment. "And now," he said, "everything you held, you've used it. Most of it. What's left?" She set the pen down. She looked at the table and then at him with the directness that she had learned early was the only mode of communication she could sustain long term. It required more energy up front and less energy to maintain, and she had always been more interested in sustainability than in the economies of performance. "Questions," she said, "about what this is, what I'm doing here." She held his gaze. "Not about the work. The work is clear and it's good, and I'm not uncertain about it." A pause. "About the rest." He was quiet. "You sent a letter through a cipher," she said, "to a woman who had been publicly humiliated and banished, and the letter said come if it serves your purposes or don't come at all. And you meant it. Both parts." "I did." "That is an unusual thing for a king to mean." He looked at her with those gray-green eyes and the stillness that meant he was thinking rather than performing. "I've had queens described to me as assets my entire political life," he said. "Things to be acquired, alliances to be formalized, functions to be fulfilled." He looked at the maps on the table. "I looked at your record before I wrote that letter. Not your personal history. Your work. 4 years of documented decisions in an empire that wasn't particularly interested in letting you make them. What you did with the eastern trade routes, the lowland grain agreements." He paused. "I wrote that letter because I wanted to work with you. Everything else I was prepared to figure out as it came." She absorbed this. "And now that it's come," she said. He looked at her directly. "I don't regret anything I've decided since you arrived." He paused. "I want to know what you think about the rest." She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about anything. She thought about 3 weeks in this palace, the maps and the supply routes, and the morning coffee set near her elbow without comment, the check-ins at the strategy room door, the moment in the storage room when he had said, "Can you run?" and had not waited for her to be offended by the question, the way he had signed off on every resource request she made before she finished explaining why she needed it. She thought about what it felt like to work alongside someone who treated her competence as a given rather than an exception. "I think," she said carefully, "that I am not done being careful. About everything." She held his gaze. "I was wrong about a significant thing once. Not about the work. The work was right. About what the work existed inside of. About what was real." She paused. "I need more time to know what's real here." He nodded, not disappointed, the nod of a man who has heard an honest answer and respects it. "Then we have time," he said. "There is certainly enough work to fill it." She picked up her pen. "Yes," she said. "There is." Vaelor arrived on the 4th day. He came with a smaller escort this time, 4 riders rather than 12, and he looked like he'd slept at least once since she'd last seen him, though not comfortably. He was received at the main gate with appropriate protocol and brought to the outer receiving hall, which was clean and properly lit now, all trace of the attack cleared away with the efficiency of a household that had been doing crisis recovery for 4 days. Seraphine came to the outer receiving hall because the outer receiving hall was where she had first received him, and because symmetry in these things was not sentimentality, it was the kind of deliberate frame that told both parties where they were standing relative to where they had been. He was standing when she entered, this time not carrying road dust because he had clearly stopped long enough to address it. He had not, she noticed, addressed the faint scar that was forming above his left cheekbone, from the storage room. She looked at it once and then at his face. "The warrants?" she said. "Executed. All 3 principals are in custody. The embedded network is at 26 confirmed contacts as of this morning. Carvin's team is still working." He paused. "The grain situation is being addressed. Emergency procurement contracts are initiating this week." He looked at her steadily. "The independent accountability body will be announced at the next House Assembly. Public reporting requirements. Carvin helped me draft the framework." She nodded. That was fast. Some things shouldn't wait. The room was quiet. "Sit down, Vaelor," she said. This time he sat without argument and without performance. She sat across from him, and the distance between them had changed again. Not the war room distance of 2 people setting injury aside for operational necessity, and not the outer receiving hall distance of the first time when she'd been running assessments, and he'd been running road dust and adrenaline. Something else. Something that didn't have an established name in the protocol she usually used to navigate rooms like this. He looked at her. He said, "I owe you something I don't know how to give correctly." She looked at him. "I know what I did at the Crimson Moon." His voice was flat, and he was keeping it flat deliberately. She could hear the effort of it, and she appreciated the effort because the alternative was the particular emotional performance that powerful men sometimes substituted for the actual reckoning. "I know why I did it. I've been through every version of the accounting since that night, and they all end in the same place." He paused. "I chose to believe people who were feeding me a story over 4 years of direct evidence. I did that because the story told me something I was more comfortable believing than the evidence." He looked at the table. "That you were capable of something you weren't, rather than that I was being managed by people I trusted." She said nothing. She was letting him finish. "I cannot undo what I did in that room," he said. "I cannot give back what I took from you in front of those people. I know that." He looked at her. "I am not asking for anything. I want to say that clearly. I came because there were things that needed to be said to your face rather than through a letter or a courier. Not because I expect anything in return for saying them." She held his gaze. She thought about the night she had stood in the chandelier light, with the crown gone and 300 people watching, and the decision she had made, but not the decision to leave, not the decision to go to Cassian. The primary decision, the one that had preceded and enabled every subsequent one. The decision not to break. Not to fracture into the shape that would have made everything that followed easier on everyone else and harder on her. She had kept that decision for 3 weeks across some of the most extreme circumstances she had encountered. She had kept it in drainage channels and storage rooms and under physical threat, and in the particular acute loneliness of being in a foreign palace, doing foreign work in the wreckage of a life that had been genuinely good before someone decided to dismantle it. She thought about what it cost, holding something like that. "I know that you cannot undo it," she said. Her voice was even. "That's not nothing. Most men in your position would have found a way to frame it as a misunderstanding, a communication failure, something that distributed the fault more evenly." She paused. "You didn't do that." He said nothing. "I'm not going to tell you it's all right," she said, "because it isn't. What you did in that room was the worst public harm anyone has done to me in my life. And I spent 4 years in a court that was genuinely trying." She kept her eyes on his face. "But I'm also not going to tell you it defines every year that came before it or everything that comes after. Because I don't believe in people being only what they did at their worst moment." He looked at her. Something in his face was doing the thing she had observed in the storage room, stripped to the bone, the exterior pulled away by circumstances that had used up every resource he'd normally direct toward maintaining it. "I don't know how to—" He stopped, started again. "I've been trying to find the language for what I'm trying to say, and I keep ending up in the same place where the language I have isn't sufficient for the thing I mean." She looked at him for a long moment. "Then say the insufficient version," she said. "I'll understand what you mean." He breathed once. He looked at her with that bare, direct focus that had been directed at her only a handful of times in 4 years, in the private moments when the performance had lapsed. "I'm sorry," he said. "Not for a policy failure, not for a strategic error, for what I did to you." He paused. "For what I chose to do. Knowing somewhere that I was choosing wrong." The words sat in the room. She felt them land. She felt the full weight of them, which was the weight of their accuracy. Not insufficient language, actually, but language that had arrived at exactly what it was trying to reach because he had finally let it. She felt, below that, the long, complicated architecture of 4 years. Not the easy version, not the cleaned-up version where she had always been right and he had always been wrong, but the actual version with all its texture, the work that had been real, the partnership that had functioned even when what surrounded it had not. The specific and painful knowledge that the person who had done her the worst harm was also the person who had been, in the operational sense, her most effective collaborator. That those two things were both true at once, and she could not resolve them into one clean feeling. She had been carrying that unresolved thing for 3 weeks. She would probably carry it for longer. "I hear you," she said, "and I believe you mean it." She looked at the table. "That doesn't make everything straightforward. It doesn't mean I know what to do with 4 years and 1 night and 3 weeks and all of this." She gestured, not at the room, but at the implied expanse of what had happened. "It just means I believe you." He nodded. He looked like someone receiving something he had not expected to receive. "That's enough," he said quietly. "That's more than I came expecting." They sat in the particular silence of two people who have said the true things and found themselves on the other side of the saying, with nowhere pre-designated to go. Then Seraphine said, "The accountability body framework, the one Carvin helped you draft." He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not relief, something subtler, the specific response of a man who recognizes a conversational move and is grateful for it. "What about it?" "The public reporting requirements need to include the Noble House contract disclosures, not just the council level. If you set the threshold too high, you'll catch the obvious cases and miss the structure." She looked at him. "The network operated through the middle level, the stewards and secondary administrators who are beneath the threshold in most accountability frameworks. That's where the embedded contacts lived longest without detection." He was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled something from his coat, a folded document, the accountability framework draft, which he had not expected him to have brought but should have, because he had come here at least partly for this reason too, and he was never not working. "Show me where," he said. She leaned forward. She pointed. They worked for 2 hours at the table in the outer receiving hall, the draft marked up in both their handwriting by the end of it, and somewhere in the second hour Cassian came to the door and looked in at two people arguing civilly about threshold criteria for financial disclosure requirements, and he stood there for a moment with an expression that was not quite anything she could easily categorize, and then he came in and pulled up a chair and joined the argument because it was, objectively, an interesting problem. She registered all 3 of them at the table, 2 kings and a queen who had been a queen for 3 weeks, and who had spent the previous 4 years running the operational infrastructure of an empire from inside a role that had officially been decorative. And she thought about what the room looked like from the outside, and then she thought about what it felt like from the inside, and the two things were different in the way that mattered. The new Imperial Covenant was drafted over the following 3 months. Not by the 3 of them alone. The process was longer and more complicated and more populated than that, involving the surviving House Lords of both empires and the reconstituted Neutral Council under Fenn's interim directorship and a working group of judicial officers from 3 territories, and more arguments than she could have individually tracked if she hadn't been keeping detailed notes. But the foundational framework had come from those early conversations in the strategy room and the outer receiving hall, and its core principles showed that origin clearly to anyone who knew where to look. Balance instead of domination. Accountability at every tier, not just the visible ones. Independent oversight with public reporting. Trade and military arrangements built on verified mutual interest rather than coercion. It was not a perfect document. She had worked with enough institutional structures to know that perfect documents did not exist, only better ones that had enough embedded correction mechanisms to address the ways they would inevitably fail, ones that were honest about what they were trying to prevent, and specific about how they proposed to prevent it. This was a better one. The signing ceremony was held at the Neutral Territories Council Hall, which had been cleaned of its contamination and reconstituted under Fenn's oversight, and which was therefore the appropriate location for a document that was meant to represent the possibility of trustworthy institutional process. Seraphine signed it second, after Cassian, before Vaelor. Not protocol. Protocol would have put her last, as the most recently elevated. She had proposed the signing order herself, in the working group, on the grounds that the functional logic of who had done what to produce this document should be legible in how it was formalized. Fen had agreed. Cassian had agreed immediately. Vaelor had been quiet for a moment, and then agreed. She pressed her seal into the wax and looked at it and thought, 3 weeks and 4 years and a night in a chandelier-lit room, and a drainage channel and a storage room, and 2 hours of threshold argument in the outer receiving hall. She thought about her father teaching her to hold information carefully. She thought about Beryl the innkeeper and his account book and his comprehensive immunity to drama. She thought about 4 words at the bottom of a diplomatic communique, I kept my word, and the person she had been when she wrote them, running on 3 days of road and a decision not to fracture, and the person she was now. Not the same, not entirely different. The person she was now had more scar tissue, more data, a more complete map of how power broke and rebuilt, and who was standing at each stage of the process. She had learned things she hadn't wanted to learn in ways she hadn't wanted to learn them, which was the only reliable learning methodology she had ever found. She had learned that the crown you are given and the crown you build from the material of what happened to you are different objects. One can be taken, the other cannot. She looked at her signature on the covenant. She thought, this is what the Crimson Moon produced. Not the version anyone in that chandelier-lit room would have planned, not the version that preserved anything intact, but the version that had come through the unplanned parts. The parts where everything went wrong and kept going wrong, and the only constant was the decision not to stop. The balcony of the Neutral Territories Council Hall faced west, and in the late afternoon the light came in at the long angle of early autumn, and the United Realm stretched out below it in the particular abundance of land that has been through difficulty and is still producing, fields and roads, and the distant smoke of a dozen towns going about the work of existing with whatever combination of resilience and complaint their populations had available. Cassian stood beside her at the railing, not touching. They were still in the careful space, still building, still adding the brick-by-brick evidence that she had said she needed, and he had said she could have. And 3 months of it had produced something she was beginning to trust with the careful, eyes-open trust of a person who has learned the cost of trusting wrong. What are you thinking? He said. She considered the question honestly. That the view from up here is easier than the work down there. She looked at the fields, and that the work down there is the only thing that makes the view mean anything. He was quiet for a moment. That sounds like something your father taught you. It does, doesn't it? She looked at him sideways. He was occasionally useful. He almost smiled. She had learned to read his almost smiles the way she had learned to read everything, carefully, with attention to what they were made of. The accountability body convened its first session yesterday, he said. Malin sent the summary. 4 disclosures in the first session from houses that would never have disclosed voluntarily under the previous system. Good. She looked back at the fields. Keep pressure on the threshold criteria. The middle tier is going to look for workarounds within 6 months. It's what middle tiers do. I'll have Pren watch it. Pren is good. She paused. The kitchen relay. Did she talk? Extensively. The network's communication structure is about 60% mapped. Fenn's team is working the other 40. He looked at the view. She had been recruited through financial pressure. Her family's debt. Not ideology, not conviction, just someone who needed money and got found by the wrong people first. Seraphine thought about this. Make the debt resolution part of the cooperation terms. He looked at her. She gave you the network structure. That's worth something real. She held his gaze. Accountability has to mean something better than punishment, or it just becomes another version of control. He studied her for a moment. You're going to keep doing that, he said. Doing what? Reminding me of the difference between a system that works and a system that looks like it works. Yes, she said. That is correct. That is what you have me here to do. He looked at her with those gray-green eyes that she had spent 3 months learning to read, and what she read in them now was something she was finally, cautiously, beginning to accept at the value it appeared to be. Among other things, he said. She looked at the view.
Among other things, she said.
Vaelor left the Neutral Territories Hall in the early evening with his escort and the signed covenant and the particular posture of a man carrying weight he has decided to carry rather than weight that has been put on him, which was different in a way that mattered. He had asked to speak to her privately before he left. She had given him 10 minutes in the small room off the main corridor, and he had used them carefully. He had said, "The House Assembly is in 2 weeks. I'll be announcing the accountability body and the grain procurement contracts and the full scope of the council corruption. In public. Everything." He had looked at her. "I'm going to name what I did at the Crimson Moon as part of the accountability. I can't ask the Empire to hold itself accountable and hold myself separate from it." She had looked at him for a long moment. "That will cost you," she said. "Yes. The court will use it." "Some of them will." He had held her gaze. "That's not a reason not to do it. You walked out of a hall in front of 300 people and didn't beg. The least I can do is tell 300 people what actually happened." She had been quiet for a moment. "Vaelor," she said, "what you're describing, that's the beginning of being the kind of king your empire can actually survive." He had looked at her with something in his face that was not quite any of the things she had previously seen there. Not the cold deliberation, not the compressed fury, not the bare-boned accounting of the storage room. Something quieter. Something that had come through the other side of a very long reckoning and found itself on unfamiliar ground and was choosing to stay there anyway. "I know," he said. "I think I always knew what it required. I just hadn't understood yet what it would cost." He paused. "Now I do." She had nodded once. He had gone. She stood on the balcony in the autumn light and thought about that, and about the strange particular shape of a story that begins in a chandelier-lit room with a crown being taken and ends somewhere like this. Not restored, not reversed, not the romantic architecture of damage undone, but something else, something harder to name and maybe more durable for being hard to name. She had not gotten back what she lost. The 4 years were what they were. The night was what it was. She was standing in a different place than the one she would have chosen if she'd been given the choice before any of it happened, and some portion of her would probably always know the distance between this place and the one that could have been. But she had not been destroyed by the distance. She had been made in the specific way that certain kinds of difficulty make people, not better in the uncomplicated sense, but more completely themselves. More certain of what she was made of, because she had been tested down to it. More clear on what she was willing to hold and what she was willing to spend, and what she was not willing to do, regardless of the pressure. A queen who had walked out of that hall with nothing had found that nothing was sufficient to build from. The wind came off the western fields and moved through her hair where the crown of the Valthari Empire sat, steady and undemonstrative, like a thing that belonged there because it had earned its place. She had not begged for it. She had not been given it. She had built it from the material of everything they thought would destroy her, and she was still building, and the building was not finished, and that, she understood now, in the particular clarity of autumn light over a realm that had survived its worst season and was preparing for the work ahead. That was not a failing. That was the whole point. A king commands fear. A queen worthy of the crown commands the future. And the future, as it turned out, had no interest in waiting. It was already here, in the fields and the roads and the signed covenant and the work that would continue tomorrow and the day after that, imperfect and demanding and entirely, unambiguously worth it. She breathed. She stood straight. She looked at what she had built. She let herself keep it.